Go.
Jack never makes coffee for me when he's drinking coffee.
That's what this is really about, Jack. I was thinking the same thing, John. Like, you never offer coffee here. There's
Never.
no coffee. Not once. You
So
don't
good
even
morning. We've already gotten started before the recording a little bit, and we've been talking about the devolution of monotheistic considerations, and we've been talking about trying to figure out what everybody else is doing rather than what we're each doing. And we've been talking about the big book as not being the source of a conversation that wouldn't go wayward, and all kinds of things have come up this morning, and the impossibility of recovery from alcoholism without some form of a greater power or a higher power than the self we think we are, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, our conversation is really geared toward a chance to look at how we communicate about the nature of our own existence, whatever that nature is. I'm not sure that I have that calculated enough, but I prefer to consider that nature would be natural, just like I prefer to consider that truth would be true and reality would be reality, rather than something I'm doing with it. It's something that I must be without the doing, something that would be essential to each of us, something that would be common between all of us, something that we don't have to think about for it to exist, because it would be something well beyond the confines of thought. It doesn't mean thought is disconnected from that. It just simply suggests that thought is a byproduct of that. And we're certainly capable of considering our own thoughts and our own thinking or our own seeming self. And if those possibilities are possible, if we have the right to do that, it doesn't make the thinking we're doing right necessarily. So to any degree that we're thinking about things that are conflicted, we're going to live in a state of doubt and a state of uncertainty and have a disturbance go on that would be clear indication in my experience that something's wrong. And to think of it as the only thing right that I need to fight for and defend against and continue to make believe that somehow I'm going to overcome it while I'm the one maintaining and creating it would be a preoccupation that is obsessive and completely unnecessary to any fruitful, gainful nature, in my estimation, any functional nature, and undermine my whole ability to actually participate in a level that would be beneficial to anyone, given my preoccupation with trying only to fight for a self I think I am, and all of the ideas I have about that self that I think would die if I stopped thinking about them. So that's more the angle of the conversation.
So this is what you're saying, Jack. Thank you. That was eloquent. You're saying this is feng shui, but the next level of it.
What?
Higher than feng shui.
No, I am simply suggesting that if we're each willing in any way to begin to notice that the limited thoughts we have are never going to be true because they're limited. If they don't encompass everything that exists, there's no way truth could be small or separate or distinct from reality. And if we're talking about that collectively in a forum, which I would consider this to be, it may be that what we do during the week and with other people that we're interacting with, we can start actually speaking to these issues in terms we normally wouldn't approach, because it would seem to offend people or create reactivity, when in fact it may be one of the most loving things we could do to express the nature of what we share in common, rather than the nature of what we think of as distinct to ourselves or as distinct to that.
Did your parents ever make you go to church? Did you have to go to church at some point? That was ever a ritual?
Nothing to do with touch. Nothing to do with touch. It doesn't.
What?
This conversation.
He's just asking a question, Loretta.
Okay, but it doesn't.
Easy, Loretta. Take it easy. It's raining.
It's very defensive. Loretta
nice and easy.
No, I'm sorry, I used the wrong tone of voice, but it just do church.
Well, it was just a question he was asking.
Okay, well, go ahead then. I'm sorry.
So
my answer, yes, I was forced.
I was too.
I was never forced, but I went along with the cadence.
God, I got to get the lawyer out of me. I'm thinking class action here, but that's another show. My parents never forced me, and I love that.
Well, your parents never went to church except the day they got married. If I remember the story right.
No, almost. They wanted to go to church.
That was
they wanted
the
to,
story.
but they didn't.
I heard the interview of Anthony's father who talked about it specifically. He asked the rabbi not to do anything that would approach religion. And the rabbi said, if you don't want to get married here, don't get married
Yeah,
here.
that's
But if you
right.
want to get married here, I'm going to do what I do.
I remember you regurgitating that.
Yeah.
So, John, let's digress a little bit, since before the recording was on and people are listening at a broader level. This idea about monotheism being a devolution or reduction of culture or a reduction of progress.
Yeah, no, let's, I'll try to go back into it. So.
Wait, did
either-
he just say
either-
devolution? Did he?
Yes,
Did you-
Evolution, Anthony.
Yes, I said devolution.
Okay.
So I think there's a lag between Anthony's voice and for some reason there's a skip.
Several years worth, I think.
So
Or more.
So-
Hey, if we're even talking about it, obviously, not only do I skip with
Anthony?
you guys, I skip with myself.
John's got the floor.
Okay, go, John.
So, Jack, you and I have had this conversation before, and I don't know if it was a conversation on the air or a conversation prior to the air, or
Right.
or part of the dialogue that we have had of the times that we've had discourse
Right.
on your show. But yes, we spoke about this because you commented that that the monotheistic change in religiosity was an evolution, meaning that we started to look at things differently than the Sumerians and their winged people coming around and teaching everybody how to do things who couldn't do anything prior, and then the Mesopotamians copying that, and then the Romans copying the Greeks, and then the Romans copying that, and just changing the names of the constellations and the gods to their language, but it was just translated. And then we had monotheism, and you had said that was an evolution, meaning that it had gotten better. We had gotten better. We had decided that 5 drinks weren't necessary. 1 drink would do it.
Well, I don't think, let's bring it into the actuality of what we're talking about now, because I don't really remember exactly what we discussed and how we went about it. And I don't think it'd be valuable to try to even surmise.
No, but I'm sure your mind hasn't changed. So let's talk about it.
Well, I can guarantee you my thoughts have changed because they're always changing. And I think if I was referencing any of that, I don't have a lot of history with the Sumerians and all those different lineages.
No. I'm just giving you analogies. You understand where I come from.
Yes. Well, somewhat. I'm working on that. But I think if there is any point to the concept, it was one that is inclusive rather than one that is exclusive. Rather than have a sense of source that is divisible and only applies to certain people at certain times in certain ways and certain things, the idea of a monotheistic God, which is interesting, suggests that it would be the same source for all people. And I wouldn't say that as one. To Anthony's point, it's not something you can have an opposite in, because the opposite of something absolute or infinite is the same. And that's where the distinction between spatial terms, like relative terms that we're commonly using within our thinking and within our functional interaction in this thing we call the world, in our brain, is relatively based. So it's always got, whatever I say I'm doing, I'm also simultaneously saying I'm not doing something else. Whatever I'm committing to, I'm committing against something else within that relative world. In a way, that sum total of the plus and the minus adds up to 0. So the nothingness of that beingness, I would suggest, define that beingness better than oneness. Because oneness would suggest nothingness. And if you can be 1 and nothing, that's the binary code of the computer, 1 and 0. That's all that it's interacting. In a nothingness source, it isn't a thing. It's simply a presence. It's a state of being. It's something that isn't in space and time. It isn't spatially driven, and it isn't time bound. So it's simply an awareness of awareness that I would suggest we naturally have, because if it exists, it would be the nature of our ability to even be human. And that would be, amongst humans, one source, but only by the limitation of humans, rather than noticing the being nature of those humans isn't singularity. It isn't functioning on a point. It's functioning in an essence that we all share equally. So I would think that the wholeness would be the humanity, if we're talking from a human perspective and how we can be better at expressing this knowing nature. It would be starting to think about it accurately enough to rely on it in the simplest terms, rather than in an argument or sort of developed manner that gives us the impression that we have to think about it in all these complicated terms and have them all add up before we can ever get anywhere, rather than simply suggest that if it is what it is what it is, and it doesn't matter what I think about it. And now I've sort of let thinking off the hook, and I have a little more freedom to start to express it, rather than constantly think I need to come to the proper conclusion of it and the right decision of it and have the right thoughts about it and all that kind of stuff. Because I know, in my experience, if I'm debating whether the thoughts I'm having are right, they are not right, period. If I'm in a debate, it's an acknowledgement that I know something's wrong, rather than a sense of knowing where I don't think about it at all. I just know it's applicable. To the other point about it being love, our ideas of love are so twisted that we call it unconditional love as though it's normally conditioned. We call honesty brutal when it's actually just confronting the potential brutality somebody's maintaining in their own ideas that might be untrue. Honesty isn't brutal. Love isn't conditional. Can't be unconditional. Love, in an essence, is something that is not something, it's not something countable. So it can't even be accountable. It isn't responsible because it isn't responding. It's simply the premise for existence that isn't even a premise. It's hard to put into words, because all the words are going to do is limit it in some way to make them wrong in relation to the expansiveness or the ever-presentness of that nature. My sense is that we have always thought about it as something somewhere else in heaven. We've thought of forever as being the most important aspect, where if you think about that, you can never get to forever, because it's always forever. You can wait forever for forever, and forever has forever to come. That is not an ever-present state of being that I would suggest is something here, is something now from a human perspective, not from reality's perspective, but from my experience, my physical experience. And if it is in fact real and true, then it would be real and true for all that are sharing in this human experience, because regardless of the evolutionary process of humanity or nature through time and whatever this universe has done and whatever the world has done, it would be something that we share equally to even be here to talk about it.
You know,
let me finish this with John really quick, Loretta.
I'm sorry.
If we can, because I think the point's interesting, because it's starting to sort of show how the bounds of our thinking seem to need to hang on to something that seems tangible, rather than start to notice that it's the intangibility of letting go and saying, wow, it's always going to be bigger than I think, or greater, because the present, anything I'm doing in the present is making believe, to your point earlier, it's a bias about what I think is true. It's an idea about what I think is true. It doesn't mean that idea that I have the right to, or the bias that I have the right to, is true. It simply means I'm thinking that. And if I really believe that, now I've set myself against all this other potential capacity that would be ever present and knowing. And I can't oppose it, but I can certainly create a physical human experience that seems conflicted and seems depressed and seems impulsive and reactive and compulsive, to try to escape the conflict I'm creating and the disturbance that I'm creating inside by making believe that it's up to me to decide whether or not some source of that nature, whatever that nature is, would even be possible.
Well, that's a thought.
Or a couple. So in our discussion, my sense is thoughts are all considerations. They're never true. They're never conclusive. We can make them. We can make decisions about them, but the decision itself is just the convenience of being able to apply something immediately. It doesn't mean it's going to apply in the next moment. which shows that thoughts are flexible, that they're very versatile, they're very dynamic in their nature. And to think of them as something fixed, something that needs to be resolved, something that needs to be settled, is to start asking thoughts to do what they don't do. And what they do is constantly change with change, because they're born out of a physical seeming reality that isn't necessarily real, but a product of reality. Our bodies, humanity, the world, the universe. All those things are functions within this seeming space and time. But the dimensions, which Gabe could probably speak to, and you could speak to, John, have been defined by humans as though they're separate because there are identifiable traits amongst them, but they are not separate in nature or in this universe. They're absolutely part of the exact same thing, always functioning dynamically. So we can't limit our experience to the dimensions that we have named as humans as the ones we function in, because we would also be functioning in all those other dimensions that haven't even been identified yet, that would have nothing to do with space and time, because they would be something in an infinite. I think the sixth dimension immediately, the fifth dimension begins to transition the seamlessness of the experience we're having that seems to be distinct and separate and apart and parts fitting together. It starts to deal with that. The sixth dimension, as I understand the definition, Gabe, you might help, begins to actually look at the infinite number of combinations within six-dimensional space. So it's actually introducing us to space that is bound, that's also infinite simultaneously. So it starts to seem like a contradiction, but it isn't a contradiction when you're in an infinite space, because everything that's possible would be possible regardless of what's thought of it.
Isn't it weird when you start making analogies to this thing called math, that no one ever questions why someone's buying 69 watermelons?
Maybe because 70 weren't available.
Yeah, so it's just that every time we get an analogy towards math, I don't understand it.
Well,
although you use that 2 plus 2 thing, that 2 plus 2 thing becoming a subconscious action, and then you don't have to think about it anymore.
Or pi never ending. I mean, really, come on. Doesn't it really end or not? Where does the last number of pi? I need to know.
Well, but it's interesting, Anthony. We talk about living forever and wanting to live forever, but numbers that go on forever, because they aren't whole numbers, they're fractions that go on forever, we call irrational numbers. So what I learned many years ago, John, is that mathematics is the language of the universe in terms of the capacity for a quantifiable state, the relative universe, to be transferred into or communicated through numbers.
Yep.
And equations and calculated. And that's largely what we use to be able to accomplish what we do in terms of relating to how do we get the factors down to get the rocket to fly at the right height, at the right angle, to get into the orbit of the moon and use the gravity. All that stuff is calculated in math. What's interesting with math is that as you start to approach infinity, the numbers start to fall apart. And the other aspect that's very interesting is that Leibniz and Sir Isaac Newton created calculus, which was a refinement of algebra, so that the individual points became graceful fluid lines simply by entertaining a factor of the infinite into the equation, and begin to see that grace started to actually express itself in lines that were fluid rather than, which meant that it accounted for the infinitesimal distance between points that are so close that they can't even be a point, because they would obstruct the point of the point that they're close to.
Right. Wait, did you call Sir Isaac Newton, what's his name?
Well, I think I called them both. So
sort of like quantum mechanics are already measured, but quantum physics are, not.
Well, everything is measured to the degree that it's happening right now, and it's doing what it's doing in whatever measurable way it's doing it. And the idea that we need to think about it and quantify it and put it in a textbook before we know what it's doing and think it's a mystery until then is to suggest again that everything is based on what we do with what's happening, rather than recognize that what's happening is happening regardless of what we're doing with it in thought.
I'm just talking about with math right now.
I understand.
The reason I brought up math, and forgive me, is that I don't understand math. It's one of the things that my children say, "Oh, Dad, you can do a lot of things, but you don't understand math.
Well, you understand it enough to know when your rent is due, that you don't send $7,000 extra dollars. Right?
Maybe.
Well, not anymore.
On a good day.
The essence of the point that I try to make about math, if I'm successful at all, is that if you understand a problem, the solution is automatic. It isn't something that you need to strive for or struggle for or think about, because the thinking is in the undoing of the problem. The thinking is in understanding what the problem actually amounts to. And it's the same in life. If we think about things in ways that create the problem or complicate the problem, we're going to continue to have problems. If we're thinking about our thinking in ways that aren't accurate, we're going to create problems within our own experience that we're going to think have something to do with the universe and the world and all the people, rather than start to account for our own impact on our own experience. Most of my experience is that most of what I pay attention to is not what's actually happening in the world freely and fluidly, but it's the interactions and inner reactions I'm having with it based on thinking I'm doing about it that isn't true. And that seems to be the dominant point of my experience. Now, what's interesting that I could be potentially witnessing an infinite state of being and be preoccupied in my experience with the discounted, depreciated, dysfunctional thinking I'm doing in relation to it, and think that that's all that there is.
Right.
So if I do that on a regular basis, and then we do that collectively and we talk about it as though it's the only thing we can do, because we tell these stories about, I'm trapped and I can't do anything else and there was nothing I could do and all that kind of stuff. And then everybody goes, yeah, I understand. Yep, I got it. Yep. You're as screwed as I am. And now we're victims collectively. And if we're not victims collectively, acting like victims collectively, our functional capacity is not allowing us to express that absolute knowing in ways that would exceed anything we've ever thought possible, so that we could begin to see that nature is in fact loving and giving and generous and beneficial, because our shift is going from thinking of things in scarce terms, in limited terms, in terms about me, compared to you, and not ever really even hearing you, but only hearing what I think you're saying so that I can support the defensiveness of my own thinking. And I can transition into beginning to realize that when I'm better, everyone gets better. And also begin to acknowledge and be accountable for the fact that when I was worse, everybody was getting worse too. And that stays the same for my human experience all the time. If I get worse, everybody gets worse to some degree. It may not seem as palpable as my experience, but the collective impact of 8 billion people bouncing off of each other's thoughts is palpable. And it's actually what's happening. It actually represents everything that's happening in the world right now, how it's going, what's happening, and largely what the circumstances are that we're all facing. Is that collective connection or consciousness, we call it. So the question is, can we be better? Can we act better? And if so, I would suggest looking at what we're doing that isn't better accurately in the simplest way, rather than in try to constantly ask these new questions that we can go off and find out how we can fracture. It's kind of like dividing one in half, Anthony.
That's for the mental obsession I was going to say, because I'm thinking he's talking about me, but I bet he's really not talking about me. I was going to say that. Then he said my name. I'm like,
we do the same thing. We think it's different for each of us, and it's the same thing. We're trying to renegotiate the terms of reality and truth. They're already negotiated. They're already.
Or what if we just let go? Like, what if we all admit, hey, I've got something I've been holding on to for 40 years and I want to let it go. And they go, okay, well, let's let it go. We're like, well, that would be great.
Well,
we never
Anthony,
we're like, well, I don't want to let it go.
If you have been listening to today, I suggested to Loretta earlier that the trap she felt she was in was simply a trap she felt she was in because she was thinking she was in a trap. If all we are is thinking that we have something to let go of because we're hanging on to a delusion that we keep thinking is true and then fight to let go of, what are we doing? It's insanity.
Or is it better to ask, like, or is it
Anthony,
better to ask Loretta, well,
can we stick to a point before we leap to the next?
I am not in a trap. I'm in a trap.
Right. That's what I was going to say. That I was going to object as far as leading to, facts not in evidence.
I'm not in a trap. So
not in a trap. She's not in a trap.
Well, at the point you thought you were in a trap, and I use that as an example, it's only what we're thinking about that we're trapped by. And if we're trapped by a thought that isn't true, what we're thinking about is delusional, and we're actually trapped in an insane idea that doesn't exist except for the thinking we keep doing about it. That's exactly what the definition of obsessive thinking is.
And I used to do that, but I've learned.
Objection, asked and answered.
I do it every day to some degree, Loretto. I have ideas that I still notice, that I become critical of other people about. I become spiteful. I become contemptful. I can feel the disturbance. And what happens is, as my clarity got better, I started noticing how seemingly intrinsic this is to my existence, and realizing how much I have hammered that stake into the ground, making believe that all I am is what I think, and I still have those beliefs. And I'm glad that you're past them. That's enlightening to me.
I didn't say that I was past all of them, but what happens is, if I'm not thinking with love, then I will get right back into it, because then I'm back into only what I think.
Well, but you're thinking that, insisting that you think on love is the answer, when in fact the essence of existence, if it is what we describe, is love. It's already your nature without your thinking, and that's the transition of this.
No, you're not understanding me. Let me try to be a little bit clearer. Thinking with love to me means to think about others before myself.
Okay, but who is it that's doing the thinking about others, Loretta?
Do what?
Who is it doing the thinking about others that you think is so critical?
Myself.
Gotcha. So you're thinking about yourself first before you're loving others.
No, Jack, come on. No. This is almost, okay. If I think with love, everything is simple to me.
It already is, though. Without your thinking, this is the big transition.
All right.
This is the big transition. If it's already the essence, if it's already the essence of existence.
Love as a presence. If you think with love as a presence or God, all right.
You're still thinking about it.
No. Okay. Then believe. Let me change that to believe.
That's thinking is just a belief in something as being true.
Why don't you let me finish, please?
Because I know where you're going. We've done this. You and I have done this 100 times in the last 6 months.
We do it because I think we both think the same thing. Why?
I don't know that we think the same thing, but I would suggest we know the same thing.
That's what I mean. So it's like.
But that's not thinking. So let me just push on this point a little bit, Loretta, because that's what I'm here to do.
What can you make?
If the knowing nature is already in place, it does not require our thinking. And this surrender is the exact same surrender that any of us who got over alcohol or drugs or whatever it was came to when we realized that we were powerless, because there's no power in the thought, I need to do something to confirm love. When I begin to see that love is the nature of things, I begin to actually witness how much I've been relying on my thinking to make believe it was something I needed to do, rather than to see that thinking isn't doing anything about love. It's simply capable of expressing it naturally, without this bifurcation and segregation and dissection of what I need to do, have to do, should be doing. And now, because I'm getting better, of course, if I think honestly, I'm going to feel better about things and less conflicted. But if I think it's up to me to do those things all the time, I've just taken on a whole new way of doing things that may be better, but it isn't ultimately a surrender of saying, this nature is already my nature. It isn't. And I use nature only as something that's natural. It's not something that would be unnatural. That's why I use the term.
So basically, what you were having a conflict with what I was saying was the word thinking.
Any other perspective?
I mean, I'm trying to see.
I know. I get it.
That's a question. It's a question, not a perspective.
No, I'm asking anyone else if they have perspective.
Oh, okay.
Can you repeat that, Loretta? I'm sorry, I missed it.
I asked him what the conflict, we both are saying the same thing. And so I asked him what the conflict was. Was it the word thinking?
Thank you.
Any perspective from anyone?
I think that thinking's an illusion. It's not the essence of what we are.
But there's an imagery to it, right? It's something we do.
True, and it causes conflict, and
It doesn't. We use it to cause conflict because we think it's true.
And if you don't have curiosity is what saves me. I mean, if I get curious, then I want to, I think differently.
So, Loretta, the point isn't so much the word thinking as to notice that the preoccupation with thinking, when we think there's a new way of thinking that's going to solve our problems, we're once again still taking credit for the solution rather than see that the solution, within a context of an infinite source, there are no problems, so there are no solutions. It's just an essence of being that is absolute in a way that is very difficult to speak to without triggering thoughts that think they know what that means, rather than begin to surrender and say, wow, we're talking about something here that is so seemingly vacuous and so expansive and so incapable of words ever defining that thinking becomes what it actually is. Just something we do. It becomes right-sized quickly rather than seeing it as something that is the ultimate goal in trying to achieve this state of being. You begin to see, oh, it's like a dam. The dam, if it didn't have water behind it, would have no purpose. There'd be no energy created. But when the energy goes through the dam is created, it's created because the dam's working, not because the dam came to the conclusion that it was going to produce energy, but because the dam has water behind it. If we didn't have air to breathe, we wouldn't have the confidence that every time we take a breath, we'd get a breath of air. It's something, this thing we're talking about isn't something that's negotiable or optional. It's just our natural state of being. And then thinking becomes not something necessary. It just naturally starts to express it in ways that we couldn't even imagine expressing because we've been so stuck in this loop of thinking we need to think about it correctly, which helps. Don't get me wrong. If we're thinking about truth is true, it's the beginning of starting to notice that thinking about it is false really has a very, very dire impact on us. But the transition doesn't mean because now we're thinking about it more accurately that we're done, and what we need to do is think about it more. We have a $10 billion a year self-help industry that's trying to help people feel better all the time.
Exactly.
What is it we're doing constantly enough to feel bad, to constantly need to feel better? And I would suggest it's the fact that we think we're in control of that essence. We're in control of how we think. We're in control of having the experience, when all we're doing is impacting our potential to manipulate our experience based on how clearly and how accurately we are thinking. Just like in mathematics. If you don't understand it and try to solve a problem, you're going to probably spend your day frustrated. If you apply the basic principles, it's pretty easy. 1 + 1, you can probably do that, right, John?
Some days.
1 + 1 is 1.
Jack, I like
Fairly well.
I like what you said about when we were talking. Oh, Lord, my thought just escaped. I'm sorry.
All right.
When I asked you if we are thinking wrong,
Yes.
when we find out we're thinking wrong, do we have to, or I always thought I would have to replace these wrong thoughts and redefine and self-help, basically. But at the same time, when you're talking about patterns and habits and things such as this, and you begin to think differently, do you believe you just start doing differently, or that you have to replace those?
Well, let's go to the book for a second in that regard. Sorry, John.
Uh-oh.
It says we will intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. Intuition is knowledge beyond reason, meaning there's no thinking in it at all. So if this knowledge that we're talking about is an absolute state of knowing, It isn't something that comes and goes because we think about it or don't think about it. But when we think about it anywhere close to accuracy, we start expressing it in ways that can often catch us off guard because we realize how defensive we've been about the thinking to even feel caught off guard. If you follow me, there's a knowingness to it that just naturally happens. And I would suggest that there isn't much thinking in that. I was with a friend earlier who said he just listened to a thing on, they hooked brain things up to Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan at some point and had them golf and play basketball. And one of the things they noticed was there was very, very little brain activity going on at all because they weren't thinking about what they were just doing what they were doing. They did it with the clarity of what they knew to do. And it isn't to suggest that that's our goal, because my sense is our natural state is already not thinking and knowing, and we're employing thinking because it's so critical to our human experience. We're overusing it and overdoing it and overcompensating and making believe that more of it's going to solve our problem, when that's exactly what an addiction is. The more I drink, the better I feel, the more Coke I get. I was never happy with the Coke I had. I was happy with the idea of what I needed. That's what made me happy, and that always came with this form of desperation, because I knew I needed more. Whatever it was, I always needed more, something else, somewhere else. Never what I had.
More is always better.
Well, it seems to be within the addictive.
No, I'm joking. That's for me, more is better.
Yeah, and it within the idea of things, that tends to be true. But in an infinite source where we're told that everything is everything and we're all sharing it, and that we can actually give it away and keep it, because we start to see that actually the fluid nature of our nature is to give what we have to everyone, which is my experience, what conversation is. It's probably one of the most common things we do to connect with other people or to interact with other people while we're already interacting with them. It's one of the most common outward things we do. As we carry the message, meaning start sharing our experience accurately about our growth, about our awareness, those thoughts get picked up by other people and they grow. It's interesting that I can have a pizza and give half of it away and I'm left with half. I can give an idea away and I still hold the idea just as anyone else does too. I give the chance to actually grow on the basis of something that isn't divisible. I don't get half the idea left when I give it away. I share the whole idea, and anyone who receives it and notices it and sees that it fits for them in some way actually grows, and the connection seems to grow too. The trust, the faith, the potential to share and do and accomplish something with somebody, rather than have a greater sense of suspicion and call it friendship. So those things grow, those connections grow. And what I've learned in here, in my experience with people, and as a matter of fact, Loretta, the group that I met you in, stayed after a meeting and said, I felt something was right, but I didn't understand everything that was being said. And I thought, for the first time, 6 or 8 months ago, I said, I think that's a very clear example of your knowing awareness being piqued, meaning it's being addressed, you're aware of it all of a sudden, and also you're aware of the thinking that seemed to be a little confounded, the understanding that seemed to be a little confounded, the understanding that seemed to be a little shy of understanding because it was starting to be revealed as something that you're doing, the collection of your thoughts that you thought you understood, were all of a sudden being approached by a discussion that challenged them. And the idea immediately is, I don't understand this, rather than my understanding is in conflict with this. And that's what you're witnessing. And starting to see that division, that seeming separation is to start to actually notice your awareness, which is intact. It's always intact. We know what's going on. We just don't always want to admit it. We don't always act in that way. And my suspicion is a lot of it comes from not talking in that way enough and starting to say, oh, that's the goal of the conversation. The goal isn't to figure out how many questions we can ask to stump the audience. This isn't a game show. But start to say, what is it we really do share in common that we could discuss openly, and start to do that on 168 hours a week rather than just 2 hours a week. And notice the difference in the interactions we have with people, and also notice the interreactions we have that are often difficult and we struggle with and don't always like and defend against, and all those things that might be considered common, but are only common to the dysfunctional thinking we're doing in relation to the defensiveness that it creates, that we create. It doesn't create it. My thinking isn't doing this on its own. It's taking my direction, and I'm just not always interested in acknowledging it or admitting it. So I think of it as something happening to me rather than by me.
This is one time I have to say I was angry for so many years about being an alcoholic. Very angry. Why would I be given this? On and on and on until right now. I am very grateful because I had to believe in a power greater than myself because, I knew I could not do it. I'm like Jack. I always wanted more and more. And I still do that with other things, but not with something that kills me.
But in that admission, I'll suggest to you, though, Loretta, that everything you do it with is also a suicidal tendency that may not be as seemingly damning, but none of those compulsive actions we take are ever following threads of health. They're never about eating more broccoli. They're never about eating more vegetables. They're never about eating more fruit. They're never about drinking better water. They're never about doing things that are good for us. They're always about something that is crippling us. And I say that because even in your, I very much align with your thinking that if it hadn't been for my serious drug and alcohol problem, I may never have stopped long enough to say, wow, I'm at the middle of this. I've been making choices that put me central to a level of desperation that I blamed on other people my whole life so that I could justify continuing to do it as though I had no choice. I don't know that I'd have come to terms with that. And I'm thankful for that, very thankful for that.
I am
and
too.
So something is debilitating. And it says in the book, pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. It's interesting that we seem to need pain to grow. And I would say that's coming from a historic addiction to thinking, that thinking will save us. And we keep pushing on the thinking while the problem gets worse. And eventually we have nervous breakdowns and we have immune disorders and we have panic attacks and all kinds of other stuff that stop us and say, anxiety disorders, all of that stuff is happening as a consequence of doing things internally in our own experience that are wearing us out, which indicates that we think our strength is in trying to overcome these things and trying to get around these things and trying to feel better about these things, rather than start to say, oh, the thing I'm trying to feel better than is in fact worse. Why not give a little attention to that and begin to concede that I seem to have a chronic impulse to do things that are not right, that cause disturbances. And if I start noticing disturbance quickly enough, I start acknowledging the source of it faster, and it starts to dissipate it before it turns into an impulse or a reaction or a compulsion. I don't see it as, I see it quicker, admit it for what it is, and I don't tend to end up languishing in those other consequences as much.
Right. I'd rather think about possibilities,
Well, but the possibility to correct that is a possibility. And the possibility to think that you can deny it and pretend it's not there because it doesn't feel good looking at it is another possibility. But I would suggest that possibility is an impossibility, because it's only going to make the problem grow and get worse to the point where you say, how did this happen again? Why am I back to that point again? How did this happen? And it's going to take somebody else typically to cause it. So you can say, everybody always does this to me. This always happens. We're creating it by denying the subtlety of it, waiting for it to get to a point where it's explosive. And not only explosive, implosive, because it's been imploding on us, which is a function of depression and anxious disorders. Think of stress. It's a bearing of a weight.
Don't you think that you, instead of all of this thinking and just about who we are, what we are, or whatever we're thinking about, the one escape that I find where I don't think negatively, and this is just for me, is when I go, like, it's not really meditating, but listening to a violin concerto, something like that, that's very simple, and letting my mind and relaxing enough, like meditating, to go to the right side of your brain, or whatever side it is, where your imagination, your intuition, inspiration, these attributes are.
So without maybe thinking about it, you referred to it as an escape.
Well, it allows my brain to focus on positive.
I get it. I get it. But Loretta, if you're listening, and I want you to just take into consideration that I may be saying things that aren't quite getting through. But what I'm mentioning is that if you don't like those negative things and you think you can escape them and avoid them by doing something else, you're actually maintaining those negative things that are going to grow. And that's precisely what this conversation is about. My sense is everybody historically, I don't think it's new, and I can't speak for everybody, but I would say largely we have learned through history to try to feel better and get over things rather than begin to actually acknowledge the things that are worse that we're trying to get over and start to actually address that stuff. They may be delusions. They may be pure fantasy masquerading as reality. They may be pure insanity and hard to look at. But I guarantee you, I guarantee everyone, if they're looked at accurately, they will dissipate. And if they're looked at inaccurately, we will be responsible for continuing to maintain them and act like we have nothing to do with them and wonder why things keep getting worse and repetitious. And we need to come up with new ways to avoid and escape and overcome stuff.
But what I'm suggesting or trying to say is whenever for me, I go over and I let myself go to my imagination, my curiosity, these higher attributes I'm talking about, I will be able to do what you just said much easier.
I know, but I'm suggesting, and I want you to try to listen to this again because I'm going to repeat it.
I heard you, but go ahead.
I don't think you heard me if you're giving me that answer because you're suggesting that you're getting over it. And I'm suggesting the thing you think you're getting over is still in there in your thought, thinking of it as something that isn't there because now you've gotten over it and feel better than it. And you're doing the things that you would be doing if it wasn't there while it's still there growing. And that's what my suspicion has been this seeming anchor that people constantly seem to need. Nobody comes to me and says, I want to feel worse and I need more negative thoughts, ever. Why would that be if we weren't thinking worse things and maintaining negative thoughts as though they're not happening? We are in a hypnotic trance, making believe that if we can feel better immediately, it's exactly what we do with a drink or a drug or any compulsion. If we can feel better immediately, we have resolved the problem, when in fact, we've never even bothered to confront the problem we claim to be resolving. And I'm suggesting this is so subtle, Loretta, that it may be just worth considering you might be doing it, despite how convinced you are that I'm not listening to hearing you repeat the story about what you do to get over it. I've heard you. I've heard you enough for months. This isn't new. I'm not deriding you for that. I'm simply observing it and mentioning it.
Okay, but maybe it is new, Jack.
Okay, but one thing that you did say, Loretta, that I want to make a note of is you said, I use my imagination and these other things of higher attributes. Can you clarify that? Why would your imagination, that thinking, that would, to me, convey compulsive thinking, because you're either getting over it or you're trying to think your way out of it, and you're suggesting that getting into your imagination is a higher attribute.
Yeah, it is for me. I'm an artist. So my imagination, inspiration, intuition, and yours too. It's the same thing, whatever you're creative with, allowing your mind to go to creativity of something that is other than just thinking about whatever it is you're thinking about. I don't know. It's like meditation in a way. It allows my curiosity, which leads to hope. It allows my curiosity to start thinking in a creative manner of like how to, for example, in art, how to paint something that will describe your civilization of today. Or if not, as one human thing, which that being of emotion. You know, this is what I'm talking about.
So in your comments, if it's leading to hope, you're hoping to be led away from hopelessness.
No. Curiosity saves me from hopelessness. I don't.
But think about this again, Loretta. You're stating the point I'm making.
then I'm using the
It's
wrong
saving
word.
you. It's saving you from something that you're creating that's hopeless by making believe somehow you need to do something to overcome it rather than begin to notice what you're doing to create the hopelessness is the reliance on thinking as a solution and thinking is your final.
That word.
You wouldn't have the hopelessness. Hope wouldn't be a goal if you
Jack,
weren't
Yeah, you're
if you weren't
creating
creating
the
a
conflict
hopeless.
and then getting over it when there's just an ever-present state of being. You're creating the whole story.
But how am I doing that when I'm thinking about art?
You're
What
thinking,
does that have to do with conflict?
You've even said you're escaping, you're feeling better. It
Okay,
gives,
then let me
it brings.
change my words. Let me
why are
change.
you
No,
getting
no,
all
Loretta,
fired up, Loretta? Settle down.
this isn't an attempt to semantically rearrange things and miss the point. This is about actually looking at the point. And I'll make another point while we're talking about it between you and Jana, because Jana brought up a point that I think is worth noting. All thoughts are imagined. That's all that they are contemplations of things in our own thinking.
All
And
right.
when we think they're true and real, we start developing a narrative about them like a play, like a playwright. And we stage the thoughts we have and we come up with what we say, well, we're stuck and people always do this. And we're actually developing a narrative, a screenplay that we actually stage in costume and have in our thinking happening and start relating to the world as though that's what's actually going on in the world, when all it is imagined. It's just something we're considering. And when we think it's true, we now think we're the Holy Grail, we're the creator, we're actually God, finally resolving the problem that apparently God couldn't resolve because we've been stuck with it ever since. And that, to me, in my experience, is the addictive nature of thinking. We don't even think we're doing it. And we think we're so convinced that we're going to get away from it and over it and through it and feel better than it without ever saying, wow, what is it I'm doing that I seem to constantly need to get over? What is it I'm doing that I seem to need to feel better about?
That thing of finding hope is what's made me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But what is meditation used for, Jack?
We live a living meditation. Everything we do all day long is a prayer and a meditation. You're just in it. You don't have to get there. You're already there. It's an ever-present state of being.
It's treated as an exercise, though, Jana. I mean, some people sit down and meditate, right?
Well, meditation and prayer is beginning to think beyond the limits of our thinking. That's what it's about. It's beginning to see that when I'm certainly not meditating, if I am meditating on the limits of my thinking, what am I doing? Thinking about myself, because I think those thoughts is who I am. That's clearly not the goal of sobriety. And it certainly hasn't been helpful through humanity for people who are egocentric to begin to be dictators and rule and oppress and suppress and kill other people in the name of what they think is right.
So
And it's,
do you agree with Jana? Do you think that all day is meditating and prayer, or did I hear that?
is our being, yes, as our being is a state of meditation because it's a fully aware, absolutely intact, inviolable, immutable, indivisible state of present knowing, awareness. It's not a thinking awareness, though, Loretta. This isn't. See that there's
that maybe, just maybe, your awareness would change and shift if you did meditate or if you did think about what I'm talking about?
Of course, it would change if I poured boiling water over my head too.
Okay.
The point is, you're starting to see that we can impact our experience so dramatically that we begin to think that impact is reality and truth, rather than simply see that it's an imposition of ideas we're generating that we think are so cherished and we think we're so committed to, and we think we're so special to be able to create them. And in a certain respect, in a very specific respect, Loretta, one of the things we have been given is a creative capacity that we squander by being so busy trying to escape the creativity of our own condemnation and the captivity we have, the captivation we have with our ability to make believe. Look at the quote that has been going out this month that was written. Read that if you've got it near you.
I do.
So read the quote, the first one.
Hold on, I have to find it.
The fact is, we seem to be intoxicated with our ability to condemn ourselves and then make believe it's not us doing it. So we've taken the story even further to make believe this is a real mystery. This is sci-fi mystery theater or whatever it used to be. We've created this whole drama and make believe we have nothing to do with it.
I've got the quote, all we are is peace, love, and wisdom, and the power to create the illusion that we're not.
Yeah, and I would say if we think we have the power to create the illusion, it's a delusion we're creating, and that isn't real power. That's insane to think there's power there, just like it was insane to think I had power and control over alcohol, or I had power and control over drugs, when consistently all I ever did was more and more and more to prove I was in control, when in fact it proved I was not in control at all. I was completely out of control in relation to it. So even in his words, Loretta, it's worth noting that I wouldn't use the word power. I would use a mistaken sense of power to make believe that I could create an illusion that I'm not those things that would be real and true, rather than things just simply imagined that I may or may not be. And this doesn't discount imagination. This begins to actually allow the passion and inspiration of imagination and curiosity to be a natural state, because it is a natural state for humans. The adventure of this, the vitality of this, the invigoration of life is the natural state for us. What we are doing is not natural, or it wouldn't be leading to diseases and disorders. It's clearly, even in the words we use, something that is disconnected and dysfunctional to be doing that on a regular enough basis to make believe that it even is something we're not doing. That's crazy, literally, which is why the insanity comes in.
It's because I am an artist. So maybe that is. In order to be able to do that, my imagination is expressed in different manners.
And
you're unique to all of mankind.
I would suggest that the greatest expression of artists has certainly not come from their overthinking and obsessive thinking, but actually beginning to. I have a painter friend who said he knew he was a painter when the painting told him when the work was done. And he began to realize that that there was a communion going on. And he also, at times, would go beyond that. He'd second guess himself and keep going. And he said, I'd have to destroy the painting and start over, because I knew immediately that I'd passed that point.
Right.
So there you're talking about intuition. Intuition is knowledge beyond reason, meaning there's no thinking in it at all, no understanding. Thinking and reason and logic and understanding are all functions of thought and rational seeming text. It isn't rational to think that a knowing nature that might be ours, and I say might because it's up to everyone to decide what they think of it and how they think of it and how they imagine it might be. The way that finally gave me a sense of freedom was beginning to realize that I don't have to think of it at all for it to be. And then I all of a sudden started noticing, wow, I've always had an awareness of that. I've just been so busy paying attention to the frustration I was creating and the friction I was creating and the disturbance I was creating, and thinking that my job was to settle all those things, rather than notice that I kept starting them, restarting them, wondering how to stop them, and realized I'm out of my mind to be doing that. And I said, yes, that's insanity. Very clearly described in my own choices, my own actions, my own consequences.
But in art, it is based on, that is what I'm talking about, is intuition.
So there's no thinking in it?
No. Well, yes and no.
Doesn't mean, Loretta, it doesn't mean we can't think. It means when we have a knowing of knowing,
your imagination,
the thinking begins to follow the leader rather than make believe it's the leader.
All right, fine. But can you agree that there is something such as using your imagination to express what your intuition is? Is that okay to say?
No, it's part of the story. You're creating a story to unravel when it's just an absolute state of being. You're just creating something that needs to be unraveled, it sounds like.
She's starting to hinge in the direction of noticing that as you begin to notice that the knowing is knowing and you know it and everybody else knows it, by the way, because if it's not divisible, it's not something we each are doing, it's something everyone is doing regardless of what they're thinking. You're starting to see that the expression, kind of like the dam, the dam isn't successful because it's holding the water back. It's successful by letting the water go and flow so that it can generate the power and the electricity that it was designed to do. We're channels, and as that light passes through us rather than seems to be blocked by us, and I would say it's always passing through us because we're always part of this system we're alive. If we're alive, we're already part of it. We're just obstructing it in ways that give us the impression it's up to my thinking to resolve, rather than start to see that the radiance and that brilliance and that enlightenment that are all words used for intellect is natural when I'm no longer busy trying to make believe that it's up to me to control it, and allow it simply to flow, and my thoughts naturally follow, just like my breath naturally comes whenever I take a breath. I don't worry about whether there's going to be oxygen for the most part, unless I'm underwater.
Make believe is not, as far as I'm concerned, what I'm trying to say has nothing to do with make believe. It has to do with intuition, knowing of how to literally express yourself visually, to communicate. Well, let me think how to say this. It is going into expression of what you are.
But that's what thoughts are designed to do, is to express a knowing nature, not a thinking nature that thinks it knows. It's possible, and we can do that. Those are options. You know what we can also do, Loretta? We have so much freedom in thinking that we can think that what is wrong is right, and think then that our life depends on defending it. We can think all those things because we're given so much freedom. Think of the freedom and the love that we are given to be able to actually self-implode and self-destruct in the name of freedom, rather than in common. If we were limited by something that was powerful, we wouldn't do those things at all, because we would naturally be condemned to a limitation of our potential, rather than see that this absolutely ever present nature is in fact the freedom to do whatever we want, and then start to actually say, it's me by my choices, the me I think I am, making choices about things that are in conflict with reality and truth that I'm struggling with. Not an infinite source, not an ever-present nature, not an all-knowing nature, not an omnipotent nature. None of those things is what I'm struggling with. It's my thinking about them that I'm struggling with, period. Nothing more than that.
Jack, do you think quite possibly you may be wrong sometimes?
I'm wrong almost every day, most of the time, in terms of the thoughts I have.
Instead of y'all jumping on what I'm saying.
I'm not jumping, Loretta. I'm simply observing. I'm observing and I'm commenting. If you've been living in a world where people commenting on your thinking feels like jumping, imagine imagine how tenuous we might be in conversations that could be enlightening from honesty and direction. I don't think I'm good at it. I just think I'm better than I used to be by doing more of it.
So do I.
That I'm better, or you?
I think I'm shifting. I think my awarenesses are shifting.
I guarantee it, my dear.
Thank you.
I can see it. It doesn't mean there isn't anything to see anymore because you've had that shift. It's starting, if we can talk about it openly, Loretta, and I found in my own experience that I did a lot of work with people one-on-one. And what was interesting is that I discovered is that people thought because they were with me and I was keeping a confidence of them, that they were safe from any other opinions and any other thoughts and any other perspectives in the world. And they went out there and thought that they had a unique experience with me and weren't actually doing the things that comes from a broader conversation. Today, we've got 9 people. We generally float between 6 and 12, right? Out of 30 that are invited, and people come and sort of circle through, right? They cycle through. You haven't been here for a little bit, you're back. We get enough bodies to offer perspective to be able to have a conversation in public, which to me would be much more experiential in relation to what we face the rest of the week, because most of our conversations are not being held simply with one other person, but in the face of many other people simultaneously. So if we have any chance to practice this, it would be to get open about it publicly in a forum that isn't always easy to face, because there are other ears watching and other potentials for comments and observations. But in my experience, I never had relations with people that actually spoke up about what I was doing. And the ones that did offered me more value than the ones that made believe they were helping me by kind of patting me on the back and telling me I was fine and I'd be okay someday.
Okay, and I get that. But do you believe that there, or do you, I see this, do you see in people sometimes limitations?
I don't see in their essence any limitation, but I see in their thoughts. Thoughts are almost always limited.
Obstinacy. Okay, let's
Well,
Our
let me-
perfect example.
whatever. I see the obstinacy in myself, so it stands out in others. As I see more clearly what I do and the contempt I have and the doubt I have, I begin to see what others have, not as contemptful, but as something I can be compassionate for, because I realize that they're struggling with the exact same thing I struggle with. And the more I see them as having an absolute infinite source rather than one that is polluted by the contaminants of toxic thinking, I begin to actually connect with them at a level that I give them all the space because they already have it, rather than limit it in my own thinking. I don't crowd their ability to actually come to terms. I do my best to see them as something beyond that. Now, do I do that well? I don't think so. Do I do it better? Yeah, I do it better than I used to.
Your consistency is what, in my experience, has helped, because you can't be bullied or cajoled into, you stick with the absolute no matter what, always, and you keep us, or you help to guide us in that direction. And I do know that years ago, like I remember Laura Alice saying, like, she spent an hour a day meditating. And I remember thinking that was so admirable. And you said then it's just a natural state of being. Our ever-present state of being is meditation. And I remember thinking that you were criticizing her.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Well,
I remember thinking that, and I don't think that anymore. But you were consistent in your message, and it's not a conflict, and it's not a criticism. It's just a consistency that gets us, or I don't want to say gets us because we're always there, but made my awareness of the absolute more aware to me.
Well, so explain that. What do you mean by your constant being in, what did you say, Jana?
My
I
constant
know
harping.
I know that I don't have to defend anymore. And if I even start to defend anything, then it's not real. It's just not real. Like I don't have to defend anymore. It doesn't make me socially acceptable. I just had a guest for a few days, and she just had question after question after question after question. And last night I just drove her to the airport. I just couldn't do it. I mean, I'm not saying that I've got this whole life thing down or how to interact with other people.
No, about your comment about in constant meditation and prayer. Is that what you said?
Yeah, what happened was, I guess it's going on 2 years now. What the awareness that happened for me, I used to compulsively think, and because I've been in real estate, I've been licensed for 42 years and I've been a broker for 25 of that. So I'm a numbers person. So I could go through my 14-year-ago divorce and I could line up in my head every property and which ones I gave him and which ones I kept. And I could go 785,000, 2.3 million, blah, blah, blah. I could totally do that again and again and again. And somehow unfolding through this group, I was standing in my kitchen, I don't know, 20 months ago. And I thought, you know what, this whole dialogue is such complete and utter ridiculous bullshit, because there's nothing that ever happened to me ever in my entire life that I didn't have my finger in. And you think that I, as the broker and the idiot that didn't work, that I was married to for 9 years, that I'm the one that decided what he got and I got, but then I wasn't happy about it later. And I could just go through this conflict in my mind, and there was no defense for it whatsoever. But once I got the responsibility part of it, I just called Jack and I was like, oh my God, I got it. And it was like, I was on a pink cloud for like 2 months, just that there was virtually nothing to defend. There was nothing to have any resentments for. I just, like, if I was 100%, and that's not 90%, no one could do anything to me, not even 1% of 100%. Everything that happened was 100% my responsibility. And once I got that responsibility thing, it was an amazing freedom. But then about 6 weeks later, I started thinking, well, if I was completely responsible, what about that ugly, mean, and bad stuff? So, I've got acreage. I live way out in the boondocks. I'd wander around my property sobbing and texting Jack, and I'm so, but then once it was a morning, I had to let go of my old ideas and stuff that I had defended, and that poor me thing that was part of my story. And usually not to people. I didn't share my story so much with other people, but I held it close to my heart. Like, I really got fucked in that divorce or whatever deal it was. And once I just took responsibility, and the pink cloud, and then the morning, and now if I start going in the direction of somebody's done something to me, I can automatically recognize I'm responsible for I was responsible for inviting that person into my house that in my mind wouldn't shut the fuck up. So I drove her to the airport. I said, I'm sorry, I can't do this, and
so this meditating and prayer, is that you're in constant meditation and prayer?
All day long. I reflect on all that there is all the time. And I have such an amazing amount of gratitude for the responsibility that came into my awareness. Sometimes I just drop to my knees and cry in joy and gratitude. And my whole awareness is different because I can't go into the stories anymore. Jack used to say,
yes, awareness is different. What does this have to do with meditation?
I don't have to meditate. I don't have to go there. I'm in it all the time, all day, every day. I'm aware. My awareness of my responsibility is just a constant state of being. When I wake up in the morning, I can make a conscious decision to know that I'm responsible for all of it, for everything that is. I'm completely responsible.
What would happen if you did meditate?
To the point that I was making to Loretta too, you don't have to wake up and take responsibility to be responsible. We're in an absolute sense, we just are what we are as we are, regardless of what we think. And when we begin to align our thinking to how that is, and to your point, Loretta, if a being awareness doesn't think because it knows, that would ultimately be the goal of meditation, is to become aware of what we know rather than what we think. Most meditation is aimed at beginning to unravel thinking so that we have a present state of awareness that is a sense of greater knowing. And that tends to be what people find when they look. My contention is that if we're doing it 20 minutes or an hour in a day and we feel better, what are we doing the rest of the 23 hours a day that is any different than that, except to be filled with thoughts about what's happening that doesn't seem to be happening when we take time out and sit in a quiet place with our eyes closed and have calm music on? And now all of a sudden it becomes a challenge to see that my experience is all of my choices are prayers. I want something for every one of them. And most of them are developed by a thought I have about who I am and who I think I am and what I think I need as a result. Those aren't prayers to God in the ultimate sense, or meditation. Meditation and prayer are basically the same thing. It's either listening or telling, asking or telling. But those are prayers to the self, prayers to the ego. That would be a diseased form of thinking versus prayers to an absolute source that's beyond all the limits of my thoughts, and then realize it's not even beyond them, it's within them too. That it's an ever-present state of knowing, awareness, that if I begin to wake my thoughts to them, I begin to see how sleepy my thoughts were as I was making believe that it was always my thinking that was going to get me there, and my thinking had to be right, my thinking this, when in fact my thinking naturally starts to straighten out when I simply concede that the absolute state of being awareness that we all share, not something I have. The big bonus in seeing that I'm responsible is seeing that everybody's responsible. So now I'm not carrying the whole load alone and feeling like I have the world on my shoulders, like that Atlas Shrugged image. I'm just seeing that we're all actually responsible. And if that's the case, why not talk about it publicly and collectively in that regard, in that way, and start to actually allow this freedom to be expressed in ways that we can't think of as fathomable now. So what we tend to think of are all the excuses to justify not doing it, and thinking about all the defenses we have for what we're doing our way as though it's distinct and different from everyone else.
Okay, so
Loretta, I do take
wait, hold on.
You asked me a question. What happens?
Taking the word meditation out of this conversation, Jack, okay? Wouldn't you say that maybe if what you are describing, and you too, Jana, has to do with love, maybe that the awareness of love.
It all has to do with love. We're all aware of it. The reason we feel alone and dysfunctional is because we're not expressing it. That's the whole point of the anxiety disorders and the diseases are happening because we're aware of a natural state that we're constantly, chronically refusing to actually concede and admit. So the fluid draw, you know what happens to a dam when too much water runs over the top of it? It destroys the dam. The water starts moving and it takes the structure apart. When the water's behind it, the structure is maintained. When I get overrun by my own thinking, I think I'm falling apart. I have nervous breakdowns. I have anxiety breakdowns. I have panic attacks because I'm being overrun by my own inactivity in relation to truth and reality, or my proactivity, the willingness. People say, I don't have enough willingness. I say, if you've been insane, you have an enormous amount of willingness to maintain it.
Okay, Loretta, I can read you one page in my book. Like it says, I will not trade miracles for grievances. As my right to experience miracles, the truth of what I am, which is love, an expression of omnipresent love. Bring to my awareness my entitlement to miracles merely by just being. Just be love and rest in that love. And then I pray to God every day. For me, that's part of my sobriety and part of my willingness. And I take a knee. I spend sometimes an hour, sometimes more during the morning time and at night before I go to bed. And I say, protect me and keep me sober today. And I'll say I bow before you and ask by your spirit to bring me to a place where I'm truly able to pray from my heart. Lord, strengthen me to submit to your way for our lives. Strengthen me to the desire to do your will, Lord. Help me to trust when it is hard to understand. You reign supreme in all things, Father. Help me to grow in discernment. Lead me on the path to wisdom. Help me to rejoice in you, to be constant in my prayer and give thanks in all circumstances. Your will be done through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So, it's not that I just wander around on a pink cloud. I ask, and I have to surrender that I'm not in charge, and I ask for help, and I ask to be protected and to keep me sober, and how I can be of service to others. And I get a sense of satisfaction out of that. But I do believe in my heart that the essence of what we are is in fact love.
So what are y'all arguing with me about then?
Nothing. No, I don't hear anybody. I don't hear anybody arguing, Loretta. I hear people talking.
What point are you trying to make to me? Because we're all saying the same thing. I believe exactly what you said, Janet. Okay, totally. I'm talking about.
So let me make a point then, because it occurred to me in both of what you were talking about. One of the things, I can concede that there's an absolute source, and I can concede that there's an infinite, loving, absolute, ever-present state of knowing. I can concede those things. And in the concession of those things, I started noticing. At first, I felt very free. I felt like it was, first of all, it felt very disturbing at first because I started to actually look at what I was doing with a level of clarity I'd never had. And it felt freeing, but I also began to realize that I was doing a lot of things that I had always thought, if I thought I wasn't doing, that I was better than. And because I was thinking in this new way, that it gave me the excuse to pretend I wasn't doing those things anymore, because the freedom was so palpable and so aware, just as you described to the responsibility thing, Jana, that for 6 weeks or so, there's that sense of freedom because all of a sudden you're not hamstrung. My sense is we don't have to let go of thoughts. They literally leave out the front door immediately when they're no longer welcome. Right? So it's almost like the guests you thought you wanted to stay are taken off. And that's a little bit of a relief, but it's also kind of like, I'm going to be left alone here any minute. And the awareness of that awareness isn't really alone. It's just becoming aware of something that doesn't have those tangible connections attached to it, because it's an ever-present state of peace and quiet and stillness. And that's the fullness. That's the absolute recognition. That, Loretta, I would say, is the natural state of awareness. It's just being aware of that. Now, what are we doing as humans? Introducing that to thought. When I started to contemplate that these absolute natures of existence were absolute, I started noticing that I had a tendency of making believe that all I needed to do was focus on that. And I wasn't doing any of those other things, rather than say, wait a minute. I've been doing things my whole life that I said I wasn't even doing. I have mastered the art at hiding things that I think are hidden. and I think I'm not dealing with, and I think aren't there, simply because I say, I'm a product of love and that's all there is to it. And I can just think about that more and more and more. But what it did was actually illuminate those things that I was doing that I thought I wasn't doing. And then I started realizing this whole motivational subconscious thing was filled with all the thoughts I wanted to pretend I wasn't responsible for. And there are many of them I still rely on, and that I would say culturally, we tend to rely on socially. A lot of ideas about how things are that they aren't, that we carry along and act like and slap people on the back and say, yeah, I know how it is, because we agree with those thoughts that aren't true. And I would imagine it's worth noting that, and this is part of the push this morning, Loretta, is just to notice that we can think all we want about what's happening and still be thinking things we don't even think are happening. And if we're delusional, that delusion is having an impact on our experience. It doesn't mean it's sane. It doesn't mean that it is functional. It doesn't mean that it really exists. What it means is that it's really having an impact on our experience, because we are entertaining ideas that are in conflict with reality and truth. And if we consider them real and truth, we are once again starting to stake a claim to reality and truth, rather than that concession we keep talking about as being so simple to make. I found it's extremely simple to make. I haven't found expressing it in every way has been that simple, because of the complications I create in relation to it.
Okay.
Or I would be better at talking about it. I would be less defensive, and I would be less reactive, and I would be less insistent, perhaps. And ultimately, silence is the voice of knowing, meaning that any gap in the game that we all have between the words we use and the time we take to insist on the things we do is in fact silent. And silence is in fact then the backdrop of all noise. We wouldn't know it's noisy if it weren't for silence. That contrast, just like a white canvas or a canvas, tends to be consistent when you start, so that it can reveal the contrasts that are being applied to it. It isn't something that comes fully made as a painting and then you have to figure it out and undo it. It tends to be either burlap or white, or you put gesso on it to get a white background. So you start from that point. Silence is that nature that allows us to even speak in human terms.
So let's talk about wills. How do you distinguish, or I can tell you how the awareness I have of it.
I'm sure.
I'm just curious because, okay, you know what? Go ahead.
So your question.
In step three,
Yes.
how, until I fully understood what the difference between the two wills, my will and God's will, okay, is when I could only move forward to step 4. So I'm just basically asking, on a daily basis, I understand prayer. I'm not talking about prayer, but I am. I do realize that prayer can put you in God's will, but I'm talking about all day. If you go awry, how do you distinguish God's will over your will? Or
there is no thing to distinguish in God's will whatsoever, since it's the absolute nature of existence. There is no, in an absolute source, there's no distinction whatsoever. Okay. The only distinction is in what I think about it. And if there's any doubt about that source, it's always coming from my thinking, period. But to your point about will, Loretta, my experience, and I think it's pretty clear, when I am thinking self-centered thoughts, self-will is what I want in relation to those thoughts. Because those thoughts are scarce, I'm always wanting more to fill them up, and it's never good for me. That's the source of this reactive, impulsive, compulsive behaviors. You follow me?
Yes. And
so if I'm feeding the obsessive thinking by thinking who I am is what I think, I'm always going to be praying for me, and the me I'm praying for doesn't even exist. How crazy is that? It's just a thought I'm having that I think is true and real. So that clearly would not be a prayer by the definition of God, because prayer by definition is an intercession with a power greater than ourself. So if I'm told in the third step to turn my will and I'm turning my will and my life over to the care of God, why is that? because I have always only thought of my will as being relative to a self that I think I am rather than who my source actually is. I'm starting to actually be introduced to this transition of saying, oh, there's something else here that has a sense of will. The difference in my will and that will is that my will is demanding, it is insistent, it is hateful, spiteful, contemptful, and condemns me. The other will has none of those traits. It's freeing, it's loving, it's generous, it's beneficial. It gives me all of it all the time. And the real wisdom in it is seeing that it's always been there absolutely in its full glory, while I made believe it wasn't, simply because I was doing something to create that impression in my thinking.
Well, I have to agree with you, you know? I mean, I just find it simple, very simple as God's will to think through love. Just treat
Yes.
others. Yeah. Just,
So one of the things I want to again remind you of and just think about and consider is that doing that doesn't dispel all these other tendencies, because circumstance, what I have learned is that when I'm sitting quietly and get these things, it's very easy to have them in that way. When I'm in the world and starting to interact with people, and I have a lot of ideas about what should be going on when I get out into the world, right? I have a lot of ideas about how people should drive. I have a lot of ideas about how people should park. I have a lot of people of where they should be on the sidewalk when I'm coming in their direction. All kinds of ideas about how things should be. And what ends up happening is how things go, regardless of what I think. But what happens is the thoughts I don't think I'm having all of a sudden become obvious, because I start thinking, this person shouldn't be doing that. They're an idiot. Why did they do that? Why? I become embroiled in all those thoughts simply by interacting with people on levels that don't line up with my expectations. My expectations are always connected to a thought I'm having about how things should be. And that generally comes from when I leave the door thinking about things I'm leaving that door to accomplish. And anyone who interferes with those accomplishes, to the degree that I think those thoughts are true and real, sets off those thoughts I thought I wasn't having when I was sitting quietly by myself and making all those other statements. And to notice that is to begin to say, oh, if I'm doing it when the circumstances come up, the chances are those thoughts are just happening. These are thoughts I'm maintaining while I'm thinking quietly. I'm not. And the beauty of that is starting to say, oh, I've put myself on a leash and wondered why the leash seems short. And I've been trying to get off the leash, and I didn't even realize I was the one holding the leash. And start to say, oh, if I'm doing it all, to the point of Jana's responsibility thing. I'm the one, any of that impression I'm creating with any interaction. And you asked, how do I know? Because I'm disturbed. I can feel the irritability. I can feel the restlessness. I can feel the discontent in the immediacy of the circumstance. And what I've learned is generally it's a little voice in my head saying, they're an idiot. That's really stupid. Why are they doing that? Why aren't they doing it this way? It's little subtle things. It's not the big things that blow up. It's the little subtle things that I save and think I'm not doing that build to those explosive moments where all of a sudden somebody said, wow, that was a little bit of an overreaction for the situation. And I'm dumping on somebody because I've been storing it, thinking it isn't there. And all of a sudden it volcanically rushes out of my mouth. And I'm sure that other person needs to hear everything I've got to say, because I'm finally being honest enough to admit what I was struggling with, not what they were doing. I'm using them now. I'm using them as a sounding board to finally say what I've been thinking I wasn't even thinking. And that's more fundamental to this conversation. And it's not always the first thing I think about when I'm in the midst of those preoccupations and those reactions. So starting to see the reactions as reactions is starting to notice, to Jana's point, I'm defensive. What am I defending? Something that has no basis. Why does it need defense? Because the defense is the only thing that gives me the impression that it actually exists. I'm using the defense to substantiate there's something there to defend. If something is so weak as to have no basis and have no denominator, common denominator, that actually gives it some credibility to exist, my defense I'm using to justify the thing as being there when in fact it's delusion. So if I notice that in my own reactive behavior, I say, oh, Now I can speak to thinking in general rather than think it's a specific thing and it's only happening when I'm with that person. And when you do this, that really bothers me. And stop doing that because it really pisses me off. And I don't like hanging out with you because you're toxic, and all that kind of stuff that we use to tell other people how to stop us from doing what we keep insisting that we're doing. Pretty ironic, we'd be insistent they stop while we're insistent on continuing.
And
Actually, it's not ironic at all.
There is no separation. Anything that we are seeing is just a mirror. We're all connected. We're all in this together. God created us as an aspect of love.
Doesn't mean we're not having divisive thoughts. And
it's true.
The point of this discussion is to begin to see that when any of us had an addiction, we didn't think the problem was alcohol or drugs. We didn't think the problem was the problem. We didn't see it as what we were doing. And in fact, it wasn't. It was the thinking we were doing about it that was really the problem. But it gave us an excuse to take our focus off of the thinking and start to do something that made us feel better. And to this point again, Loretta, if we're doing that in present sobriety, we're not emotionally sober. We're still on a dry drunk thinking our thinking is going to get us away from that thing, while it's the thinking that we're doing about that thing that's creating the thing we want to try to get away from. And I would say it's worth noticing that, spending a moment saying, oh, if I'm doing that, it might be worth admitting I might be doing it. And I would say if you consider anything as even possible, rather than you believe in it or you don't believe in it, to believe in it and not believe in it for the sake of believing in it isn't going to lead you any better than not believing it when it actually exists. If you just say, maybe, it's a consideration, just begin to contemplate it. My relationship with those things I used to think I was hiding and that weren't there, all of a sudden allowed me to see them as being there when I finally said, maybe I am doing that thing. Because I had a relationship to it that was friendly enough to watch it and look at it, rather than one that was denying and fighting and having it seem hidden from wanting to avoid that fight.
I totally agree with you. Totally. I think the only thing I am not clear, that came unclear, is, and I don't meditate, by the way. I do slow down for a while, just to, probably because I'm older, and I just like to gather my energy. I don't know, but I do. I'm not really sure what you're actually saying. I think it's very different from what I'm saying about going to.
Listen, Laura, when it comes to words and thoughts, it's always going to be different. There's always going to be a division there. It's because the knowing nature, there's no division because there's nothing separate. There's nothing apart, as John is describing. In our thinking, it's always going to be words that run into a short. We're not looking for the right words here. We're looking for an essential experience that's a vital spiritual experience compared to a critical thought experience.
Right. I agree.
The very definition of salvation is the freedom from concepts.
Okay, fine. All right, listen. I'm talking about using your imagination, your curiosity, your intuition, and I'm talking about it creatively. I think that's where we're going, where y'all are not understanding what I'm saying.
Loretta, I think we've all listened to it now 3 or 4 times, even just today. I think we get it. I don't think we're lost in that. I think you're talking about utilizing your creativity and your innovative capacity to express yourself in ways that are fulfilling.
No, but go ahead. What is your definition of that then?
It doesn't matter. It's if you are living comfortably with what you have, and there's nothing in this conversation that's of any value, you will continue to rely on those things as you see them, and may come back at some point and say, you know what? I want to be a better listener at what's being said than a purveyor of what I'm thinking. And that transition happens. It happens. It's not something I can induce in you. It's not something I can tell you to do. I can repeat something 6 or 8 times, almost identically, and have you think I'm not listening to you because what I'm saying doesn't align with what you're thinking. Mm. But that isn't the case. And to some degree, Loretta, I'm not going to, I don't want to dabble in, if I begin to think that what I need to do is understand all the thinking you're doing, I'm beginning to imagine that what I should do is become a master at insanity, because some of that thinking is not sane. Same with me. I'm not trying to figure that out in that regard, because I'd be insane to figure that out. What I want to do is step back and say, let's look at it in a way that isn't in conflict. Let's look at it in a way we could talk about it and just begin to concede if there is something absolute that we all share, we could probably agree that it's absolute and we all share it. And if we base a conversation on something we can agree on, chances are that conversation will go in directions that will be a long way from the ones that we have when your story is attempting, or whatever you're saying is attempting to be heard in such a way where everybody says, now I finally understand you, Loretta. Now I get everything you've said. Now I see what you're saying. And yes, of course. Rather than, you're going to make it up the way you want to see it. You're going to hear it the way you want to see it. We're all doing that right now, each one of us. So one thing we're given is this right to think the way we want and talk the way we want as a result of the thinking we do. So the question is, what happens when we start thinking about things in absolute terms, if we're actually thinking about those things rather than thinking about our definition of those things and thinking about our experience of those things and thinking about our process in those things? What happens when we just start saying, if the absolute is absolute and we all share it, what can we do with that collectively right now? Now.
If God is love and he created us as an aspect of that, we're not separate and we're not apart. And love holds no grievances. We're an outpouring of this love. We can't suffer or experience lack because our creator wouldn't do that. I can't die because my creator is eternal and infinite, and dying is associated with time, which has nothing to do with the truth. I am not at the core of my being a body. A body is transitory. No worship of idols, my ego, another person or things, my self-concept. These are all illusions. Salvation is a freedom from concepts, and self-concept, individual self, is non-existent. Let me not see an illusion of self or ego mind. Let me remember my creator. Love is what I am. Love is how I got here. Love is my creator. Love is my profession. My creator did not create this as I see it. I see things as fear. That's what I wrote yesterday. I don't know if that helps, but that's how.
Well, Jana, to touch on that book I've referenced that Jack put me onto, the I Am That, and I'm going to butcher the sentence, I apologize, but he said something along the lines of, the question was about, what is love, or how am I love? And his response was, you are love in the absence of fear.
Yes.
Well,
and the
love
books
isn't.
I didn't hear that.
Love is, there is no fear in love. Mm-hmm. So he's speaking, what we're struggling with here, Loretta, is our humanity, not our spiritual nature. And that goes for everybody. I don't struggle with reality. I struggle with my thoughts of reality. And what he's referring to too, because the guy he was talking to went there to interview him, and the journalist, he was speaking to his human experience. That love is our nature when we're not preoccupied in fear, because when we're preoccupied in fear, we think that's our nature. We think that's what's happening. And to your point, Jana, about, and yours, Loretta, about reality, if you start noticing that all we're ever doing is creating illusions that we think are real, we're creating thoughts, which are images. And when we think they're real and we think they're true, we all of a sudden think we're the creators of reality and truth, so that pain becomes real. And we use pain to justify the reality of those things we're doing, when the friction is all being caused by thinking something that doesn't even exist happens to be real and true. That experience is being used. Pain is an indication of something that's wrong. It's not an indication of truth and reality. It's an indication that something is wrong in the physical, natural system. It's a lack of health in a naturally healing environment.
I like that, Jack.
Thank you. I like you, Loretta. Listen, you have come leaps and bounds from the original discussions, and I don't say any of these things to try and backtrack and condemn or jump on anybody. But I know, given the lack of honesty that I've experienced in most of the communications I've ever had with people through my life, that I am not very well adept at speaking in terms that are accurate enough not to be offensive and not to be all those things we think are so reprehensible. So I don't try anymore to avoid those things. I allow those things to happen because you asked, how do I know? I know when I'm reactive that I'm defending something. I know when I'm irritated, I'm defending something. I know when I'm defensive, I'm defending something. And I know that when I have that reaction in me, it's always connected to fear because I'm afraid of exposing and being exposed for the fraud, literally the imposter syndrome of my thinking about who I think I am is going to be exposed at any moment because somebody's getting close. And I need to fight to keep them from finding that because I've never had my pants pulled down in public. And I'm not quite sure I'm interested in having that happen. And that facing of it can be daunting and can be a real stretch. And historically, it's been written about through fairy tales and all kinds of literature as being the most difficult thing any of us ever seem to do. And I would suggest that's the case because we're not doing it often enough, commonly enough, regularly enough to make it normal. So what has become normal is abnormal. And what's become common is disease rather than health and healing. And what's become common is spite and contempt rather than love and compassion. Those things aren't hidden. They're not somewhere else. We're just chronically, I would say, addictively connected to and relying on a source that isn't a source at all, except to our imagination, that when we think about our thinking, it becomes who we are. Thinking of itself does not create who I am. And yet that's basically the underlying narrative of all of the thoughts that I struggle with, that I'm struggling for my life. My life depends on maintaining these thoughts. That is not true. It's never been true. It won't be true. I can think it and I can suffer from it. And what's really suffering? The impact on my body. What's my body? Something I have, not something I am. Simply a vehicle that I have to channel, to express that knowing nature that I have. And the question is, if I am in pain, if I am in doubt, if I am dysfunctional, am I doing it well or am I doing it dysfunctionally and painfully and not well for others? The goal is in what can we give that's valuable to somebody else, not what can I maintain and fight for so everybody else finally sees who I am, but to say in clarity, if everybody starts seeing who I am, they're as insane as I am to think they're seeing something that's delusional, rather than recognize that the thing that we each keep fighting to have is the thing that we all share in common, absolutely, all the time, always have, always will, and it isn't even in time. It's not even in time. Just from a human experience, we're always sharing the totality of everything that we have. We're just not doing a good job of expressing it, I would suggest. And I think the world amply supports that in the dysfunctional nature that we're witnessing so broadly and in so many ways where they're not even bothering to look for a motive anymore. They're just saying it makes no sense. And for years, all these killings and stuff that people did, you'd say the motive is unclear. When people go and kill 12 kids at a school or whatever it is, that's insane. You don't need any more motive than that. It's not going to make sense. Why look for it? What they're looking for is excuses that people use to justify it. That isn't a motive. That's insanity to use an excuse to simply say, well, somebody pissed me off when I was in third grade and I just felt like killing 12 kids to correct it. That isn't health. That isn't mental stability. But they're starting to say in the paper recently, I read 2 of those things, and they said they're looking for a motive, but it appears to have no connecting sense. It appeared to make no sense. And that's probably the most honest I've seen them deal with from a journalist. There is no sense to be made of those things. It's insane.
So
Thanks, MK, for that insight too. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to see you.
You as well.
Even on the black screen.
I'm a mess over here. Don't worry about it. I'm just working out, stretching, listening.
Yeah.
So Jack,
Yes.
do you think, or what is your opinion, or however you want to say that, that awareness has to do, or growing in awareness definitely we know I'm pretty sure mine has to do with my spirituality because it understands it. Or it's just another depth. Let me take that out. That might be too specific. It's just another depth of seeing.
Another, I didn't hear the word. Another death?
Depth, DEP.
Depth. Oh, yeah. If anything's measurable, it's within thinking and a relative experience. So begin to notice that the absolute nature of knowing it doesn't have depth. Truth isn't deep. We call it that because we stand at a distance from it, making believe it's somewhere else.
Well,
Truth doesn't have depth. If it exists, it's absolutely present where we are, available, in touch, and in reach, not out of reach. Okay? So awareness is a knowingness, that ultimate knowing nature that I would call our nature, the absolute knowing nature of knowing, an absolute state of being, doesn't grow because it's not in a it can't shrink and it can't grow. It's starting to see that what doesn't change, by the way, doesn't change. And we're talking about in absolute terms, things that don't change. They're just static. They're absolute. They're ever present. They're always the same, absolutely reliable, absolutely assured. And what do we struggle with? Reliability and assurance. In thinking that we need to stabilize thinking rather than say that thinking is destabilized by its nature. It's always changing. And when we think of it in any way other than what it's doing, as something we need to stop, as something we need to fix, as something we're trying to do with it what it's never going to do, because things within a relative, this form-based universe that we're in, everything in it is always changing. And the one thing that doesn't change is that everything's changing. So when you start looking at everything rather than some things as distinct, you start seeing the absolute nature actually does show up. Good example, if I'm thinking a thought that has no basis, it will never work because it has no connection to reality. So the absolute nature shows up in the fact that it will always fail. It's not negotiable. It's not optionable. It's not half the in and half out. It won't work, period. Now, in our experience, we have lots of threads in the thoughts that we have. They're not all just one single thread. But if Orville and Wilbur Wright decided they could fly one day and jumped off a 10-story building, they never would have discovered how to fly. So if what we can do is where we're doing it right now, and the first thing we can do is start noticing we can be doing what we're doing, that it includes the things we're doing that aren't right, that we think are right, and we can start to actually become better at addressing those things so they vanish and leave through the front door, while we still may want them to stay there. Bill Wilson said in the 6th step, I believe, that there are some of those things we don't want to let go of. We love them too much, he said. And I would say that's a misuse of the term love, because from a self-centered view, love becomes hate. Love becomes condemnation. Love becomes what people have to do because they love you. We love them, and you should do this for me because I love you. That isn't love. That's a new form of abuse in the name of love. That's how we treat things within the insanity of thought. That isn't the ever-present nature of being in love. That being in love doesn't demand we do anything, which is why we have so much freedom to be able to go wrong and make believe it's the only thing we can do, and then claim it's the right thing. We're talking about humanity here, not just us sitting on this conversation here. We have a race of people who are struggling with our own planet that has been bountiful enough to give us everything we've ever had, and we can't seem to treat it with the kind of dignity that would allow it to sustain its nature, while in fact it does a pretty good job given the amount of stuff we've done to it that hasn't been that healthy.
Loretta, I think what I've gained is a sense of inclusiveness. Like when you say, I'm an artist, so I think this way, I now think that we're all in this together. Like you are me and I am you, and there is no separateness. And I feel like I'm home in that thought. Like it's let go of we have to judge, we have to judge where we're going to step and stuff, but I don't feel the separateness anymore. I feel like, what can I do to make cumulatively all of us feel better? think like, what can I do to raise my awareness so that people will look onto me as something successful, or I don't feel like that anymore. I feel like it's all of us together, all of the pain and all of the joy.
Seeing it clearly, though, also, Jana, is seeing that whenever you're better, everyone's better, regardless of whether you're thinking about them. You know, the one thing we each have that we seem to be endowed with as humans is the right to think whatever we want. And that includes thinking we're not even thinking what we're thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we have that freedom, and we're causing impacts on our own experience that we're constantly trying to overcome, we're always also causing those impacts on everyone else that's giving them the impression it's out of their control because it's happening to them because there's so many other people doing so much of the same thing. And yet, it's intimately part of everything we're all doing, while in fact we have this right to do this thing we call alone individually. When we do make choices, I choose what I want to eat. I choose how I'm going to breathe. I choose where I'm going to go. I do make all those choices distinct from everyone else. Now, it doesn't mean I'm distinct from everyone else. It means that I just make choices freely within my own ability to choose. It doesn't mean that they're choices that can't be made by others or aren't being made by others. It just means that I'm the deciding factor when it comes to my humanity. And if we're talking about functioning literally, like literate, as though we're learning to read. If we're learning to read, it's about understanding the words, the makeup of a sentence and the makeup of a paragraph and what the point of the story is and all that kind of stuff. It's starting to put the words together so that the complexity of it becomes comprehensive rather than something seen as distinct and separate. If we're doing that in our own experience, we're starting to see that this functional capacity we have would probably be working better at a global level if we were thinking about things that were real and true accurately, rather than making believe it was up to thinking to conclude them. If we simply did that alone, the shift in awareness and the shift in functional capacity, the functional literacy, literally, would begin to function on a literate and literacy, like the stories, all of a sudden become useful and gainful and purposeful and moral. And we can learn from our mistakes and correct them and go with freedom, not with contempt and feel I'm embarrassed because I did that. And how did I do that? And I'm stuck in this thought about what's no longer happening, thinking about it as something that is happening. Our capacity would be enormous compared to it, at least our functional human capacity would be enormous compared to the expression of it today, which seems to be enormously dysfunctioning and becoming sort of a new standard for a norm. It isn't normal to be sick and insane and unnatural and unhealthy.
So there's a distinct, or let me ask this, Jana. If we're connected, and we are, I agree with you, but I'm seeing a distinct difference in what I was talking about with art. Is like, I'm talking about how to, maybe in a little bit more of a business sense. It depends on what I do with creativity, depends on how much money I make.
What you do is what we're all doing, because it's all cumulative. Like, okay, so there was this guy that on Valentine's Day left some chocolates by my door. And I called him and said, I don't want this to be misconstrued. Yeah, I'm a whore for chocolates. I don't even have them in my world. So I was pretty excited. It was a pound of C's candy. And I said, but I don't want this to be misconstrued that it's anything romantic, because that's not my gig with you. And he got really mad. And he was like, he was an older guy and he was doing his own agenda. But I was like, look, we're all in this together. Whatever is happening, just say it. And he goes, well, I just feel like you were being a self-promoting narcissist. So I called my male friend and said, this weird misguided thing happened. And his first thing was, well, when somebody disrespects someone, they're disrespecting everybody. And that really resonated with me. Like, he didn't attack him individually or say that he was an ugly, mean, or bad person. He just felt that it was a misstep for all of humankind. Like, we weren't all in it together. We were separated out because there was an attack there. And he ended up calling him and talking to him. And somehow, miraculously, we all get along now. And it was because we didn't separate out something that could have been potentially a pretty heated separation. But his immediate thing go-to was, yeah, when someone disrespects someone like that, we're disrespecting all of us. And I don't know, it just feels good to all be in it together, and not that you're an artist and I'm not an artist, or that you're talking about business or not business. It really is that we're all in this together, and that we all want to support. I want to support the rest of humanity and have that comfort of being at home with one another, and to stay out of the fear and stay into the love, and not let my mind go to judging or ugly, mean, or bad things. The highest and best is that we're all together. We're all one. We're all hopefully just an expression of God's love.
Ultimately,
I try to stay in the love. I used to not get when Jack used to say something, I'm up to something. I never understood what he was saying when he was like, I'm up to something. I totally get that now. If my mind is going in a direction, I don't like to consider anything less than love. And that might sound like a ridiculous goal, but if things become patterns, if that's what I write about, that's what I have all around my atmosphere, that's how I remind myself that anything less than that is just an illusion. It's an illusion, and all illusions are just fear. And yes, I'm human, and yes, I've had a lot of fears, and yes, I've created lots of stories, and it's I don't know. I just think we're all in it together. There is no separateness. There's no separateness of our thoughts or our goals, because isn't it just all love?
well, let me make a couple of points. If it is, then it is. Doesn't take my thinking. It's always been that way, regardless of what I thought.
Right.
There's the freedom. It's starting to notice that it's already that way. So I don't need to do anything with my thinking to prove it. And I don't need to do anything with my thinking to disprove it. But if I'm thinking I'm struggling with it, it's coming from my thinking, not it. Okay? So when you're talking about staying in love and all that, you're suggesting that you can fall out of it, when in fact you're not falling out of it. You're just falling in love with the thinking you're doing that isn't love at all. It's a complete misuse of the word, because it actually violates the whole term of what love is, because you're falling in love with hate. That's a problem in terms of human experience. It's not really a problem that's any more than an illusion. But if we can think things that aren't true are true, we know what the impact on our human experience is dramatic, because it's drama.
Yes.
It's the beginning of, it's not telling us comedy story. It's not funny. It's taking things so seriously as to make believe our life depends on them. And one of the points to consider, and these again are just things to consider during the week and talk to people about, is that rather than thinking about what we should or shouldn't be doing while we're doing what we're doing, begin to concede that if you're having an experience where you feel conflicted, that experience is actually happening, that it is happening, not it should be happening, it shouldn't be happening, it is happening. Rather than ask, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? Where am I trying to get? What am I trying to do? Just simply say that it is happening for me to be having this experience. What's the transition? I'm moving away from this idea that my experience is anything other than in the present, because that what's happening is always happening in the present. That it's happening is happening in the present. And that isn't a question. What is a question? So what does asking what mean? That I'm doubtful about what is happening. That's good information to look at accurately and say, oh, my doubt is an indication that I even doubt what I'm thinking. Not reality and truth. I'm not doubting reality and truth. I'm simply doubting what I'm thinking. That's good information to have, because I can complete the circuit and immediately notice that it's what I'm thinking about what's happening as though it's not happening that I'm struggling with. Why is it not happening? Because it's something I should be doing. If I should be doing it, it means I'm not doing it. And what am I doing now that's causing the idea of what should be happening or should have happened not to be happening now? Obviously, something that has nothing to do with reality, because what is happening is that which is happening now. And if my experience is I'm discontent, I'm irritable, I'm restless, I'm anxious, I'm stressed, I'm conflicted, I'm angry, I'm spiteful, I'm petty, All of that is coming from the thinking I'm doing about the thinking I'm doing while I'm doing it now, not somewhere else.
And those thoughts always bring shame. You know that.
Yes, and
You
guilt.
know what I mean? That when I start feeling sick to my stomach because I'm judging somebody or I'm thinking they're not doing it, if anything's being done that I feel isn't being done the way I would like it to be done, I start feeling sick. I go, oh God, why am I doing this? Why am I trying to, sully
But
something?
that awareness, I'll bet, Jana, of the sickness has probably gotten better as you've had this experience and this shift, you call it, whatever.
The
As you start,
responsibility.
when you start actually looking, you'll start seeing. When you're looking for not seeing, you'll think it isn't there. That isn't looking. That's called delusion. That's called an attempt of the blind leading the blind. That's called I'm looking at something pitch black because there's nothing there and saying that I'm blind rather than say, no, I'm seeing nothing accurately. There's nothing there. I'm seeing pitch black perfectly clearly. Right? That's a transition of awareness, to your point, Loretta. Starting to actually entertain in thought, and rather than a defense against everything I'm thinking and everything I think I stand for and everything I talk about and have to correct everybody else's thinking in relation to my thinking, start to say, oh, if we're talking about something that we all share, we're just not that good at talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually have a conversation about something that's really only about consideration. It's really only about possibility, rather than a lack of probability or a lack or an increase of impossibility. It's starting to say, oh, if this is our nature, then talking about it collectively will probably have us tell a lot less stories and act a lot less defensively, but also be able to start talking about the impulses we have to do those things as something laughable rather than something we need to fight for and stop having people think of as something that's obscene or offensive. It just naturally starts to become a conversation. You go, wow, I just had this thought that I was going to launch in this direction, and I could see the impulse coming.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because we're conjuring the thoughts. Conjuring used to be what was considered ghosts.
Yes, yes.
And so that we're doing what we're doing is a guarantee for all of us all the time, because what's happening is always happening as it's happening, guaranteed all the time. Now, it's interesting that we would look to doubtful thinking and questionable thoughts for more assurance when the assurance we always have, we completely dismiss and think isn't even there. We don't even want to concede, wait a minute, everything that's happening is already happening. That's assurance. Everything I'm doing right now, I'm doing right now. That's assured, period. There's no question in that. There's no what, why, where, when, how. There's no crusade. There's no adventure into exploring. There's none of it. It's just a simple fact. In the moment, the absolute being revealed, where it would otherwise seem to be completely invisible, untouchable, inaccessible, out of reach, somewhere else with someone else with some more or less of something else, rather than, nope, it's all here right now as it is. I'm doing what I'm doing right now as I'm doing it. I'm thinking what I'm thinking right now as I'm thinking it. The impact of that experience is having on my body is happening to my body right now. How long am I going to wait before I acknowledge it? What's it got to do? What do I have to do? How much pain do I need to create before I finally come to terms with what I'm doing? And when I do, I won't be coming to terms with what I did now. I'd be coming to terms with what Jana said, the cumulative effect of everything I've been denying, to the point that it builds up to a point that it becomes so obscene that I'm sure everybody else is wrong, the world is fucked, and everything else is impossible, rather than say, oh, I have been incorrect in my thinking. I've been lying about it. You know what the biggest collection of artists is, Loretta?
Well,
Bullshit artists.
you should know.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Me too.
But think about how, as a species, we have developed this line of reason that's completely unreasonable, and we've called it rational when it's completely irrational, and we've called it sane while it's insane, making believe that someday we'll get the thinking right to feel better, while denying the worst that we're feeling is coming from the thinking we're doing presently now.
You know what's even weirder is that
E is before I in the word.
Well, yeah, but the lack of conjuring, like I just found out something. I found out that Delmar moved to Guam and he didn't say goodbye to me. And I potentially, in my old self or my unaware self, would have had hundreds of hours of dialogue. I probably would have called you, Jack. I would have cried. I would have asked for co-conspirators to discuss why I should have these feelings of pain and betrayal, and that he owed it to me to at least fucking say goodbye because wah, 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 wah. And somehow, amazingly enough, I got that when I found out. My daughter called me and said, you know, blah, blah, blah. I said, I was wondering why he hadn't come over for like 20 days. Last time I saw him, I made him an omelet like 20 days ago. And I thought, like, I'm up to something. Immediately, my first and forethought was like kind of like I got kicked in the teeth. And then I thought, but why? It's his life. It's our life cumulatively as human beings to all be able to make choices, and difficult choices because of all the things that he's experiencing with his Parkinson's and his dementia and everything. And I wanted to conjure up more drama. I really missed it.
What I'm hearing, though, is that you're starting to see that circumstance, which is really consequence, is actually the textbook for the points we don't want to make believe we're thinking and doing. It's actually giving us all the information we need. We keep searching and searching everywhere that doesn't exist rather than pay attention to the fact that when we make decisions, we immediately face circumstances based on seeing through the eyes of those decisions and that thinking. They're always that way. And what's interesting is you felt caught off guard by what he did because you had ideas about what he was doing. That's all.
No, what
if he had said for 6 months he was moving to Guam.
How it would have affected my ego. Like I should be entitled to a certain amount of whatever the fuck. And ultimately how I could unwind it so quickly was because that's where I had wanted him to go, because it's the best place for him to get care. And he's got a loving sister there. So I went immediately to that rather than, what about me? What about me? He should have said goodbye to me.
But you also noticed an impulse about all those what about me's too.
I wanted to, full on. I wanted to create more. I wanted to create drama. I wanted to call you and whine to you.
To the point.
I really did.
To the point about that it's happening, starting to actually notice that is starting to notice other things that we might think aren't there that are there, that we're still managing in ways we think should go away because we're not paying attention to them, rather than saying, wow, when something as simple as circumstance occurs to me as something I'd rather not have, I'm given a clear view into the thinking I'm doing about that circumstance that tells me I've still got some work to do. I've still got some openness to open. I've still got some potential to look at things with new, fresh eyes. Rather than I'm better, it's not happening. All I do is think about passion and love and peace and everything's great. While there's this backdrop running like a computer. We don't see what's happening in the computer, but if the computer looks the same, whether it's rebooting or trying to reboot. If it's rebooting, it's actually putting all the things back together. If it can't reboot, it's struggling and struggling. The only difference is the amount of heat being used from the energy being burned up in the system, trying to get it to do what it will never do because something's wrong with the information in there. It's exactly the way we operate. We think if we don't look like it, it isn't happening. And we think if we can pretend it's not happening, that we don't look like it, when in fact, most of us talk about it's written on our face. We wear it on our shoulders. It's on our sleeve. We wear it on our sleeve. All that kind of stuff we talk about and then don't realize, no, we're revealing it because we're uptight. We're not listening to other people. We're preoccupied by the thought about the thing that just happened that we want to solve. And till I can't pay attention to anybody else until I get this resolved in my own thinking. And it's just nuttiness.
That's why I drove that girl to the airport. I didn't want all her thoughts to intrude on my obsessive whatever the fuck. Yeah. And I did it. I knew it. I was completely aware of it, but there's no other way around it. That's the only thing I could do it's all I could do. It was the best I could do in my human experience as of the last 24 hours.
The fact is, whether it was better or worse, more or less, it was what you were doing. And the concession of simply just saying it's happening is like saying a thought is a thought. Rather than think of a thought as who I am, which it isn't, and then wonder why I'm struggling with what's happening, start to say what's happening is happening. Well, that it's happening, it's pretty damn well assured. Because it's always been happening as it's been happening the whole time I've been making believe I needed to figure out what the hell's happening.
It's the beauty of neutrality. That gives neutrality.
Just coming to terms with what's happening. It's
And
just saying,
I'm still digging for the parade a little bit, thinking like I should be causing some more drama here. I should fucking be conjuring up some more drama. I'm entitled to that drama.
most of that also is basically trying to concoct a scheme where he's going to pay you for the drama you created in some form of blood, sweat, and tears. There's something.
Maybe not him, maybe you. From listening
Yes,
to my bullshit and
the immediate connection is what he did. The immediate connection is what he did. But
Well,
the blood splatter
Bingo.
hits the whole room. It hits the
Bingo.
whole room and the world. It's all part of it.
Yeah, my defense of my wanting to cause the drama would be because of him, but he doesn't really owe me. You do, as my friend and cohort and co-conspirator, to jump into my drama with me and feel sorry for me.
So I'm gonna go another level here to consider during the week, and we've crossed several of these thresholds, all of which I don't even remember specifically as to recap, but I'll get better at writing that stuff down and starting to put this in some sort of formal order. Ultimately, it's not the person that does the thing that reveals the conflict in us. It's the who we think we are that we hate, that left a long time ago because it's never really been there, that's threatened us all along for leaving because it's never really been there, that's threatened to betray us because it's never really been there. All of those potentialities have been there because we thought it was real and true, and it's an internal dialogue we're having with something that doesn't exist, and using our experience with everyone else to justify it because we're unwilling to claim that responsibility for what we are in fact doing. We can talk about God and love and all that stuff all we want. We can think we're immersed in it, and we are. But it shows how far thinking can go to imagine it isn't, to be able to have those experiences triggered by circumstances when we're really beginning to actually have our own experience of what we're actually thinking and our own idea of the relationship we're having with the self we call ours, and start to realize it's only my thinking about who I'm thinking I am that I'm struggling with in relation to other people. So for all that we are and all that we are collectively, the pinpoint of my lens, how I see things, is based on the relationship I'm having with something that doesn't even exist.
Exactly.
And so what do I see? Insanity in others. What do I see? Everything wrong in others. What do I see? The world is difficult. What do I see? Life is impossible. When I'm defining what I'm doing in my own thinking, that's it. Now, if I have a knowing nature, as my thinking starts to be let off the hook, all of a sudden, for me, I just sat more quietly a lot, Loretta. I just had time where I just sit still, and I had no idea what to do. Literally, I was not impulsive. I just sit there saying, there's nothing I need to do right now.
Exactly
Absolutely
right. That's
nothing.
why I'm trying to conjure, because I don't know what to do with this fucking neutrality. That's
It's
such
funny.
an amazing gift.
We claim to always want peace until we get it, and then we want to immediately figure out how to obstruct it.
Because I don't know how to live with it. I mean, I'm resting in peace. Who thought that something would happen that I don't feel entitled to my drama?
Think of that term. We only think we put rest in peace on gravestones, hoping people who die rest in peace. We don't think of it as a condition we can experience during our life.
It's an amazing gift, but it's scary to me because it's unfamiliar.
No, you just used it perfectly, and it's really interesting that we think people only rest in peace when they're dead.
Right.
And think of the near-death experience situation, of people finally recognizing and being aware of this profound knowing nature that they become aware of only when they're in the face of death, rather than start to see that we're in the face of death right now because the reality we think that's true isn't true. And it isn't even at risk of dying. It's only our thoughts we're afraid of having die that keep us from that greater sense of awareness. We're so compelled to make sure these thoughts are real and seem real and constantly maintained because we're afraid to face the fact that they've never had any basis in reality at all. And all they have been is conjured up, and all they've been is a ghost haunting us, and all they've been is chasing us to get over stuff, rather than say, there's nothing to get over, an absolute state of being, because it's already perfectly intact. And if all I'm afraid of is what I'm thinking about life and what I'm thinking about who I am, then it's what I'm afraid of is no longer thinking. Think about death. Death can't be contemplated without thinking. You can't be dead and contemplate death. There's no way to think about death. That's why we're afraid of death. We're not afraid of death. We're afraid of thinking stopping. We're afraid of not being able to think because our life depends on what we think. And we know when we start thinking about death, we can't even think about death without thinking. So we know we can't think about it accurately. So what do? Create this whole hodgepodge of what's wrong, what's horrible, what's ending, all that stuff to justify continuing to think about it in those same ways. It's just a new form of betrayal, effectively, of an absolute state of being that can't be betrayed except in the thinking we do. And we become the hostage taker, the master, the slave, the contempt that we're claiming everyone and everything else has, and that life is. Isn't
there
true.
was a little bit of shame in my lack of drama because I felt like if I had really loved him, wouldn't this be a dramatic? You know what I mean? Like I literally felt a little bit of shame, like I should be.
I will suggest that you're sensing the shame that we all share in the dysfunctional, abusive approach to what we call love and what we call care, which isn't. It's a contractual obligation that people better behave or else we're going to never see them again and talk to them again.
Exactly.
That is not love. It's actually allowing them to do what they want and saying, you know what, you can do it, but I'm going to tell you what I think about it, and start having a relationship based on honesty. And when I started doing that, Katie started opening up in ways that I'd never seen her open up. And she's as open as any human I've ever known. But I said, sweetheart, I know that you feel attacked by me very often. I know that you feel assaulted by my words. I'm going to tell you that all I'm doing now is telling you a thought I'm having, because if I'm having the thought, it's already impacting you. And I would rather, given that we've decided to share this experience as intimately as we do 24 hours a day, like I am with everyone else, but since we're living together, I'm going to mention to you, I'm having this thought. And when I did, she said, well, that's an interesting thought. I never thought of that.
And because you said it's already impacting you anyway, that's huge to me.
Yes, that thing we have,
exchange of energy, right?
That paranoia we have isn't paranoid. It's actually aware of things we think aren't happening because we don't see them and they're unspoken. We're aware. That awareness, Loretta, is greater than the thinking we do about it. It's greater than the words we use in relation to it. And it's greater than the experiences we're having with all the other people, because the essence of our essence is so perfectly clear that anything that is unclear becomes obvious to us. It's a very different experience than starting to see something that's unclear becoming everything that is, and the only thing that I am. And all I can do is try to deny it by becoming reactive and hateful and spiteful and contemptful and addicted to some new compulsive urge to give myself a preoccupation to make believe it's not even happening.
Right. And so when you become aware of emotion, as that is what it is, an emotion, drama is emotion, feelings, they're not real. They're just.
But they're created as a consequence of our experience. They're literally motion. They're literally the current nature. They're really expressing in color, because all emotions are related to a color. They're expressing whether we're actually experiencing and expressing the totality of the light that contains all colors, or acting in ways to only have certain colors prominent: green, envy; red, hatred; blue, sadness; yellow, cowardice, fear, all that stuff.
Who define those?
What's that?
Who are you? Where are you getting this reference of color and words?
Well, if light, an absolute nature of light, is absolute.
Using a word with a color.
What's that?
Did you just make that up, a word with a color?
No, people have been using those for years. I just saw that if there's rainbows that are basically always present, we just don't always see them because we don't have the atmosphere to allow them to be visible, then it must be that the absolute white light, that nature that has always been used as this awareness of a pure, absolute, unobstructed, non-shadowed, non-dark brightness, enlightenment has been used, brilliance is used. What are some of the other words that are? Radiance is used.
He didn't just make that up. He made it up a long time ago, Loretta.
Thank you.
Well, we've discussed it, but what's interesting is that, I mean, there are some physics to back that all up, Loretta, because there was a point when scientists began to realize that when they analyzed the light coming from a star, that there were black lines where the rainbow of colors is, the red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, violet, that range of the spectrum, the light spectrum, which, by the way, is a very, very small spectrum on the electromagnetic spectrum where all of the energy in the universe is conveyed. They were noticing these black lines. And what they realized, they couldn't understand it at first. And what's interesting about the color spectrum is that the color spectrum lines up to all of the elements, gold and platinum and all of the different things that exist in the universe that are considered elementary, meaning that they're essential elements, they're basic properties. And that list is still adding. It used to be 92. Now it's up into 100 something. But what they noticed is where those black lines lined up was the nature of the star. The helium wasn't reflecting because it was actually being in the star. So the light was missing where the helium line is that showed up on the color spectrum. And if it was hydrogen, the hydrogen line would be missing. So they were given information, ironically, not ironically, from the stars as to what their makeup was by what was missing, not what was present. The presence was being exhibited just like our presence. If I think I am preoccupied by thinking that's blocking some aspect of that absolute knowing light that I have, I'm going to convey things that include sadness and fear and all those other things on that spectrum. And notoriously, historically, we've used color to describe feelings. I didn't start that. It's been used. Passion has been purple. Blue has been sad. Green has been envy. Yellow has been fear.
Well, I've always heard red is anger.
Yes, red is anger.
But
Good.
yeah, I hear you. But with elements and things like that, elements especially you can use, all of those elements have a common denominator, and that is light.
In what?
All of the elements have one common denominator.
Yes, they cannot be further reduced.
No, it's with light. They are all formed with light.
Yes, but that's what I just described. The rainbow represents every one of those elements. Because the spectrum, they're visible, the elements are visible. The spectrum is relating to those elements on a light spectrum.
She's looking for you to say it's light, Jacqueline. She would like that better. You would say it's light.
Why don't you tell her that, Anthony?
That's okay, Anthony. I get what he's saying, but I'm going to be honest, I did not understand it that way.
Well, I'm not sure you need to. And the fact is the universe is doing what it's doing and physics is doing what it's doing. And we don't really, if we can conclude it in a simple way that's general enough, I'd rather live with it in that way and talk about it than start to think of it in ways that become so esoteric and complicated that it seems like something you don't understand. And as a result, don't understand is actually happening the way it's happening. So part of this conversation is starting to boil down to seeing that we can think of things general enough to be at ease with them rather than diseased or uncomfortable or disturbed.
I like that, Jack.
Yeah. So, but what's interesting when you start looking at that, and that's where a lot of this came to me, is it starts being obvious that all this stuff is so apparent, it's so visible, it's like an open book, literally. Right? We're watching everything that's going on and we're seeing it, but thinking it only in the relation to our thinking rather than starting to see it from a knowing nature and begin to know that we always, like you'd said earlier, Jana, when you went back to when you thought you didn't know, starting to realize that we just thought we didn't know something didn't mean we didn't know it. It meant we knew it all along. We just didn't think we did. And it again shows how thinking can be so obstructive when in fact it never obstructed anything. There's the absolute again. We thought it obstructed it, but it never obstructed it. What does that mean? Both ends are complete. Both ends are whole. The opposites become the same thing rather than distinct and separate.
So you're describing awareness then?
I would say, yes, at an infinite level and one that actually we can enjoy as humans because being created from, I don't know that we're created or we're products, whatever it is, we're byproducts. We're not the creator of reality and truth. We are a byproduct of it in some way. Thinking is a product of what humans are. It's something bodies do. Thinking doesn't happen outside of my body unless there's a knowing nature, and that wouldn't be thinking because it would know what it knows. It wouldn't have to think because it already knows everything. What would it be thinking about? It doesn't have a self because it doesn't think of itself, because it doesn't think, it knows. So what is that? An essence that can't be divided and must be the essence, just like those elements, Loretta. Those elements are essential because they cannot be further divisible. They cannot be reduced anymore because they're pure gold, silver, platinum, hydrogen, helium, all of the different elements that make up the universe and actually make up our bodies. So our bodies don't go anywhere when we abandon them or walk out on them or whatever we do. They just transform back into the elementary nature of the elements before the elements take on some other role, whatever that is.
Jack?
Did you just say whatever that is?
Whatever the body ends up being.
And we're out of time, guys. So whatever it is.
Well, again, in simplicity, to reduce things to what they are as being what they are.
Yeah,
everything
like
accurately.
Right? How can you go wrong with it is whatever it is?
Yeah. Well, even whatever it is as it is.
Yeah.
Whatever is another question.
Right.
Whatever will it become?
But doesn't that have to do with perspective?
Depends. There's
No,
no
perspective that never has anything.
There's no perspective in a non-dimensional awareness. So in an infinite source, there's no perspective because there's no dimension. So, but within what we're talking.
Do you ever ask your higher power anything, Jack?
What is well is for us.
Yeah. Why do I keep thinking of it as something that isn't higher?
Right. I'm just trying to I own askyourhigherpower.com. Just trying to plug in. So wait, how can I? What do you ask your higher power?
I mean, specifically?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about, right? Or generally, whichever you like.
Well, you're talking more specific than general. The things I get to are the things I admit I don't think I'm doing. So I talk to that power. What I try to do in my experience during the day is notice that whenever I'm talking to the limits of my thoughts, I'm talking to myself. And whenever I speak beyond those limits, I'm beginning to speak to something greater than those thoughts, which would be a higher power. So if my interactive capacity has any chance of perspective, Loretta, on a human level, it doesn't come from fighting for the defense of the limited thought, but beginning to notice that the limits actually define the beginning of everything else, not the end of anything else.
Right. And that being thought like that, has your concept, like as step two describes, has your concept of...
Can you come closer to the mic, Loretta? Sorry to interrupt, but it's like you're so smart and I want to hear everything.
Oh, I'm sorry. Has your concept changed of God?
Well, when it comes to thinking, it's always changing. Has God changed? No. I would say that the thinking I do about it is always changing in some regard. And it isn't to suggest I shouldn't be thinking about it or my thinking shouldn't be changing, because thinking is always changing, just like all things in a relative field of whatever this is, vision, illusion, whatever the reality that we seem to be facing is, that isn't reality, but it's reality unto itself. If it's always changing, then my thoughts should always be changing. And the question is, am I thinking in ways that harness that knowingness because they're intuitive thoughts, a knowing thought, expressing it, or am I trying to come to the conclusion of it within my thinking? That's the difference between self-centered thinking and thinking of myself, rather than beginning to actually notice that whenever I'm thinking about my thinking, I'm always thinking to a self I think I am, because I'm believing that somehow those thoughts thinking of themselves are going to get me somewhere, when in fact all they do is constantly it's turmoil and emotional. It's emotional turmoil and inner conflict that's really being created.
Right, and some people thrive on turmoil and inner conflict. You realize that, right?
Yep.
Well, I'm happy you do.
Hey, so let me ask you a question. When did you realize, the exact moment you realized you were different? You're like, I'm just not like everybody, right? That's why we're all here. It might as well be, we're all different than everybody else. And
is that really a question? I mean, I
when did you realize you were special?
I'm not.
We're all in
What?
this together.
Oh, there, I'll disagree. Jana will argue that one. You are.
No, we're all in this together.
Anthony, in an
there's
infinite
no
space, there is
separation.
no more or less. There is no division.
Can I tell you you're special? Is that wrong? I can't say
Yeah,
you're
it's
special.
wrong.
You're like,
No, but it's a failing of humanity to make believe that some people are and others aren't. Why do you think they wait to turn somebody into a saint until they die, but fear that they'll disprove the point they're trying to make? Think about that. They
Well,
never
I just want to go on record. I think you're special. I don't care what you think, or, you know what I mean? You are special, buddy.
Anthony, if you didn't have
Right? Jana knows it. Jana will preach that
Anthony,
all day long. When
Anthony,
you don't think you're special,
Anthony.
we have a disconnect.
Anthony, pretend you're Elon Musk and your launch is going to explode. Just give up for a second.
Right? I was all over that. But then he announces that was good news. I'm like, what? Good news?
If we all have the same basis, the only value I have isn't special. It's unique to all of us.
Just try saying you're special. Just try it on. See if it fits.
I spent enough years imagining that and never saw that it worked. So I'm
Doing
going
mass amounts of cocaine. I'm special.
I'm going the direction of beginning to notice that if there were no value in this, there would be nothing to offer. And certainly that would not be that special. And the value is, in fact, what we all have naturally. It's what we're all doing with it that we're not always doing identically. But if we're doing it wrong, we're doing that identically. And if we're doing it right, we're doing that identically. So seeing it more as a collective rather than something that's unique to each of us is beginning to actually think in inclusive terms, as Jana mentioned, that she had that awareness that there was an inclusive nature that she'd been fighting for exclusivity from. It's interesting that we fight to be special and then claim about suffering from loneliness. We want to be exceptional, except we don't want to be alone. Think of the irony in these things that we do that make no sense because they're conflicting in our own commitment to them. I want to be so special that nobody's like me, and then I wonder why nobody likes me. I'm alone. What am I doing? Wondering, I get all the attention and still feel alone. That is historically very common with people who achieve fame.
Mm.
The sense of loneliness becomes even greater because they don't understand the kind of attention they're getting. Because within their own experience, they're still struggling with the sense of connectedness and interconnectedness and inclusion because of this sort of exclusion that Henry Ford, one of the great actors, said that he loved being on stage because it was the only freedom he had not to be himself. And when he was off stage, he didn't quite know what the hell that meant. He struggled with it and he admitted it openly. He felt comfortable on stage because he knew he was acting. He didn't feel comfortable in his life because he didn't know when he was acting. That's an indication that people have
So
been...
what would you say your three core issues or your three core values are?
I wouldn't.
Well, that's big. You know what I mean? I was embarrassed to ask because I knew I couldn't get them, whatever they
Anthony,
were. Like,
answer your own question. What would you say?
I was going to say yours are better, mine are worse. It's like when you say that's what I love about you. Like you just like, why you don't have to play that game.
Well, it's not, nothing is ever a matter of have to. Think about the word have to. If you look it up, I've looked it up etymologically through its history. It never meant anything other than to possess something. But how do we use it? We have to do things. We use it as though it means demand. That because I have it, I have to do something about it. So what do? We have to have things. That's addictive thinking. It isn't true that we have to have things. If we already have everything and we're already a part of everything, we've already got it all.
Well, so you don't have core values. You don't have three core values.
I wouldn't say they're any more core than all value.
Wow, that's a changer because in stock, when you're selling stocks, you're like, we have core, these are our core values. This is what we are, right? And you're like,
you know why people use those things, Anthony?
Because they don't know who they are and they're trying to hide something.
Because they don't have any core values. They're trying
right. God, I love it.
You know, how many times has somebody told you
mine
something?
are always wrong. I'm so like mental. That's my whole problem. Like mine aren't the right core values. They're not. I should be improving them more, right?
Well, you work awfully hard at it. Tell me if it's working.
I don't. Yeah. Right. Yes.
See, again,
yes,
if you're thinking from thinking's terms, Anthony, you're always going to have a shortcoming. You're always going to have scarcity. You're always going to think you need more because your thinking is going to offer you.
No, that's the old Anthony. The new Anthony, we don't do that anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was like, I don't have core values. I was like so pissed I don't have core values, really. You know what I mean? I could make up 3 top core values.
What are core values?
Right, there you go.
I don't know.
Well,
what-
ultimately, it would be something valuable. And I would say that reality and truth would be fairly valuable because they're worthy of their own account. Something that's false, acting as it's true, is even admitting it's not true by acting as though it is.
But I'll tell you my core
Think of-
values, just for
think
the
of
record.
that, though.
Core value is honesty. Like if you're not honest, and as I'm saying that, you could always be more honest with, I'm honest with everybody else, but not myself enough, you know?
To the point of worthy and value, there's nothing value in things that aren't honest because there is nothing that isn't honest that really exists.
Whoa.
So that's why,
awesome,
but
dude.
Anthony, honesty is just a human expression. God isn't honest.
No, you said don't go there because you just said there is nothing that doesn't exist that's not right. I love that. That's where you're at. I want to be on that side of the fence.
No, it's not where I am. If it's true, it's where we are.
Jack, I love you, right? Is that weird?
Anthony, what do you mean you're honest with other people, but not with yourself? What does that mean to you? Like you're
means
honest
it's
in your
impossible.
judgment of other people?
No, that's my growth. Like I would never say that.
Give me an
Old
example.
Anthony, the old Anthony says, my core values are honesty, integrity, whatever it is. But now I admit
Sanity.
that I could have that with other people. I could be honest with everyone else, but not
Give me an
myself.
example. Give me an example of you being honest with somebody else. Give me an example.
Okay, I've never been honest with anybody. What is your point? No, just kidding.
Anthony, you can't be honest with others if you're not honest with yourself. That was the
Correct.
point.
That's my
That's the point we made earlier about the fact that we use all these excuses and other people and other circumstances to justify our own unwillingness to look at the fact that we're creating the viewpoint that we think is offering us perspective because of the denial we're doing about the point we're maintaining in our own experience with who we think we are. There is no honesty in making believe who I am is what I think. What am I going to do? I become a bullshit artist. I become concerned about how I look. I become concerned about what other people think. I become offended when they don't think like I do. I become resistant to having a relationship with them. They become toxic because of the toxic thought that they're approaching in me that I don't want to admit I'm having. This whole thing comes down to this relationship we have with the self that we don't even have.
Right. So if you're up like 12 hours a day, how many of those 12 hours do you spend being unhappy about something? I'm like unhappy about 2 hours a day about something. Something's not right. Right. 2 hours. That's a long time to be unhappy about something.
Well, let's say any time would not be worthy of an absolute state of being expressed, because I would suspect joy would be the common denominator and happiness would be natural because of the adventure and the expansive nature of something so awe-inspired that there would be no gap for this preoccupation of making believe unhappiness is even possible. It would just be, I would think it's a state of bliss well beyond the joy and the things that we use in terms of happiness. Because generally speaking, when I feel really happy, it's just because I'm not subjecting myself to as much bullshit as I just was. like I've freed myself from that somehow. I've freed that sense of self from that sense of pain that I was suffering. And there seems to be, when circumstances change, it seems to offer me some kind of relief. But I also notice that very quickly I tend to find the things I'm not reckoning with in my own experience in brand new people, places, and things to justify the same old thing because I've never really uncovered how deeply vested I am in this self that I think I am and the opinions I have about it. And my sense is speaking at a broader level begins to actually expose the weakness of my own ideas. Because I know that when I speak to more people I spoke at a meeting recently and there were probably 200 people there. I have a much different cadence in my talk when there's 200 people watching than when there's 12. I've gotten more comfortable with 12. When I've got 200 eyes, I'm still wondering, what are they thinking? There's some part of me that's self-conscious. And what is it but the consciousness of a self that doesn't exist that I'm worried about having found out in the face of more and more people. So my sense is the direction is to continue to talk to more people so I can become used to saying things more accurately. So when I'm talking to less people, I have a greater chance of being more honest publicly.
Or just picture them all in their underwear.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that simplifies things for me.
The consistency of your message has been the gift. And you haven't, in my experience, you haven't really altered from that. Maybe your clarification has become more aware, But your message has been very, very consistent.
It doesn't change.
It does not change.
So that, Loretta, and looking at the thinking, just start to notice that anything that's changing isn't reality and truth. It's just, it's an illusory interaction of forms that are interacting with one another.
Well, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So the thinking, when you were asking earlier about how do you know, the thinking doesn't change, so it's always assured. So if there's any doubt, or the knowing doesn't change, so it's always assured. If there's any doubt, it's coming from my thinking. If I simply resolve that and say, I'm up to something, like I told Jono, my mother used to ask me, and then I started asking myself. You know, she'd say, she'd know that I was up to something. She could see it written on my face. She'd know immediately. And I'd immediately say, without her saying anything, I'm not doing anything. Why did I say that? Because I was up to something. I do that same thing in my own experience and wonder why I keep struggling, rather than say, wow, when I notice it, it's probably worth noticing, and just conceding, I'm doing it. Whatever it is I'm doing it as I'm doing it. I don't have to figure it out. I don't have to wonder why. I don't have to go into the depth and the what, the why, the who, the where, none of it. I'm doing it, period. And what happens is, my experience, that relationship now is friendly. So the thing I thought was hidden isn't hiding from me anymore. It's not running from me, because I'm not creating this experience in my own head, by the way, of a self that I think needs to hide from the abuse I'm about to heap on it. Because now I have a relationship with this thing that doesn't even exist, but at least it's based on something friendly. And I can start to actually see the levels I've gone to endow it with spiteful, hateful conditions, qualities, characteristics that I have made believe I had to keep secret, because if I ever let that cat out of the bag and never told anybody what I actually thought of myself, everything they ever doubted about me would feel true and right and real. And I would want that to be the last thing I ever did. Mm-hmm. Rather than say, you know what, if I mentioned some of these things, some people would probably laugh. And we could all laugh about it together. And I would never have to enter that world where I made believe keeping it to myself was actually the benefit, rather than simply acknowledging it and saying, come on, who's kidding who? And when I'm asking who's kidding who, it's me kidding the self I think I am that's actually kidding who. That's the whole premise of this discussion, is really getting to the point where we realize we're creating it on our own account. And to be accountable for it is just to simply concede the simplest things we're doing as accurately as possible in the most general way. Because now, rather than think of each thought as needing to be fixed, I begin to actually treat thought as a whole thing that I'm doing, which is integrated, by the way. That's what integrity is. It's to integrate rather than dissect, bisect, divide, conquer. Of course, in Miracles said we spend our life dividing and never conquer. Because as long as I think there's something to divide, I always think there's something to fight, and I always think there's something to gain by beating it. And what am I doing? Creating an experience with my own experience that has me at odds with myself constantly, thinking that somehow what I really need to do is feel better about what's wrong by pretending what I'm doing that's wrong is right.
Well, I learned something about honesty. I thought I was being dishonest with myself when I was going through this wanting to drink situation about last weekend, I think it was, when really what it was to me more was that I had prayed to start being very aware of where I was going and what I was walking into, because alcohol has never bothered me before, with other people drinking around me, like at parties and things, but this is a very progressive disease. And I mean, right now it does. And I didn't want to think that it did, but it does. And so instead of focusing about being dishonest or not honest with myself, I realized that maybe it was that I was acknowledging what I had prayed for, or, just being more aware of where I'm going, what I'm walking into, this type of thing. Does that make sense?
Even your words, think about this, Loretta. You said that you didn't want to think it was out of your control, but by thinking that it might be, you started to actually grow in your awareness of what was actually happening, rather than only what you were thinking is happening, right? something to that effect.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to pose something to you, something that's been very helpful in my experience, is that when I begin to realize that all of my conclusions are doubtful, I stop fighting for them. I just realize I'm making the best guess at any moment about something that's happening that's already changed from the time I originally said the decision is made. It's already changed right now. Everything I just said everything everywhere has changed since then. And we're talking seconds here. So when I started looking at that, I started realizing, well, there's much greater possibilities than I would normally imagine. If I begin to imagine things I think are impossible may in fact be possible. Now, within insanity, that's the whole basis of insanity, is to think that something impossible, an illusion, becomes reality. But I'm not dealing with that in this instance. I'm starting to just simply say, maybe there's greater real possibility. Maybe if reality is infinite, it is so great that I'm never going to be able to contain it in a thought, and I'm never going to contain it in an idea, and I'm never going to have enough belief, and I'm never going to have enough faith, and I'm never going to have enough hope to ever ascertain it, but then begin to concede that I don't need any of those things because it gives me the possibility to have all those things and to know that it's real intuitively, and not need to believe and have faith and all that stuff because I'm no longer straining under the weight of my thought, thinking I need to get there. I'm starting to concede it's where I always am, you always are, we always are. Everything and everyone always is in that absolute state of presence. And all of a sudden, I began to realize my thinking is just this little thing I do that had been made to become so much to make believe. What is the ego typically but grandiosity? Inflation, arrogance, this idea that I'm bigger and better than I actually am. And what I really need to promote is what I need to do is have more confidence. I need more ambition. What I need to do is have more drive. I need to work 26 hours a day. I need to do things 110%. It's impossible. Nobody's ever done anything 110%. Unless what the thing they were doing 90% of to begin with. The point is that the actuality of what's happening is always happening. What I'm doing is always what I'm doing. And if there are elements of what I'm doing that I don't even think I'm doing, certainly I wouldn't qualify that under the banner of great awareness. And if I can begin to concede in the possibility that maybe something that's happening around me that I would quickly defend and fight against might have something valuable for me, I start actually looking at circumstances being something that's always telling me exactly what I'm thinking. Because when I'm thinking things that when I think things shouldn't be happening the way they're happening, while they're happening as they're happening, there's something wrong in my thinking to imagine that what's happening all of a sudden should completely be stopped and start happening in some new way simply because I don't think it should be happening. It's really a revelation of starting to see how committed to this thinking I've been and how long I've done it to make believe that it's going to someday become true. And that's exactly what addiction is.
And what if something changed to how you, in your thought mind, wanted it to be miraculously, like it just happened? Would that bring peace or happiness or?
The irony of it, Jana, is when I started actually letting things go where they went,
right,
I all of a sudden realized they always ended up better than I thought they would, even if I had them go where I thought I wanted, because what I was thinking was so limited and I was so addicted to this scarce idea that I had, that all of the bounty and the abundance of all possibility well beyond my thinking was lost in that. Not really lost, but my experience of it was lost. And all of a sudden things started happening that I thought, and I started laughing because I'd say, I never would have thought of this. And all of a sudden I became grateful naturally. I didn't have to create a grateful list every day. All of a sudden I said, wow, that is profound. What's profound? Forefinding. What am I doing? Starting to see, I've always had it. I've always been there. I've only been thinking I wasn't. And the nature of that became incredibly abundant, my work world and my relationship world and all that kind of stuff. And it still is to some degree. My question is, what do we do if in fact if there's a seed or kernel of reality in this conversation that can help people?
Yeah.
What are we doing to expand that conscious awareness and conversation? And what are we doing to keep it small? And in my experience, I have not been very ready to do this because I've never been a very public person in my life. I've always kind of carved out a life of my own. And I've done that so much, I thought that was the goal of life. And now I don't see it that way. I see how do I actually step into this with everyone else's help, as you've all been so willing and generous to help shape and direct and guide? And what do we do to actually take this conversation to the people that are around us, not in ways that convince them and need to fight for it, but in ways that we start actually saying things that we normally wouldn't say and do things we normally wouldn't do, so that there isn't that immediate kickback, which you can't refuse people the right to be reactive. You can, but they're going to be. They're going to do what they're doing. And when people do what they do now, I began to realize that part of what they were doing was natural for the thinking they were doing. And rather than see it as something being done to me, I started to just simply see them as somebody who is struggling with the same thing I'm struggling with. And the camaraderie and the connection started to grow in ways that might seem ridiculous to some people. But at the same time, the development of the relationship started to actually, the development of many of the relationships I have started to grow in a direction where people started listening with better ears, because they didn't see that I wasn't there to attack them. I wasn't there to convince them. I wasn't there to sell them. I simply made some comments and let them go live on them. And the next time I saw them, generally people would come back and say, you know, I really thought about that. That thing really bothered me. And all of a sudden I'm engaged. And I'm talking a lot about people who are on the street, who we've basically written off as hopeless. But to talk to them honestly, that's all they're lacking, is actually human contact. And what we're imagining is what we need to do is spend billions of dollars buying them new condos. That's going to solve it. That's like giving kids ice cream for being bad. What are they going to do? Let's figure out something we can do that's wrong so we can get more ice cream. We're thinking about it backward. And to talk more openly about this would be to expand this conversation and allow it to expand. I'm not trying to do that, but I'm going where I can and taking the years that come and sharing with them what I can. I don't know that I'm good about it. And I think that this conversation is obscene to a lot of people because it threatens the basis of pretty much of human history in terms of who we think we are and what we think we're here to do.
Well, I used to defend against in my brain. I don't know if I did verbally so much, but I used to defend against a lot of what we're talking about in the beginning. And it took a long time for my awareness to open up, to be accepting of, or to concede. Whoever knew I was going to feel a concession every minute of every day of every hour, all the time. I'm conceding. And it's a beautiful thing, to just let it go. And who
or just
knew?
let it be.
Yes, exactly. Just let it be. And sometimes
when there's no conflict, there's no persistence of this idea that we're stuck and there's something wrong and all. It just allows things to be as they are. By the way, they've always been that way anyhow, while we were deluded into making believe they weren't. So, I mean, we've got 14 billion years of proof that things have always been what they are. And yet we live in this little world where we think it's only what we've been thinking about them that they really are. And that's what reality's been struggling with, our thoughts. Rather than our thoughts are struggling with what reality is and the profound nature of this reality, not just this material world that we're seeing that's always changing, which is a product of that reality, these forms that we see. We don't even see the substance of most things, but we know that by looking at their form, there is substance to them for that form to exist. And it's interesting that we can make believe that we only have to believe in things we can see and think of before they're real, while we actually look at each other and never see the blood, sweat, and tears on the inside that are functioning. We only see the exterior and qualify that as who you are and what I think, when in fact you have a whole substructure of trillions of interactive molecules doing what they do to give you the experience you're having of a knowing awareness that isn't based in a body. It isn't based in a pair of eyes. Or think about that spirit doesn't breathe. There is no inhale or exhale in that. There is no good or bad. There is no anything other than an absolute state of knowing awareness. It's just consciousness, pure, unadulterated consciousness. So that isn't what we think. That's what we know. And if I know it, everyone must know it too. Very different approach to a discussion that tends to tell people what to think, tell people the truth. Like people argue about, I'm telling you the truth. Think about that. If the truth is true and we all know it, what do we need to tell anybody? What we're really sharing is, how do we get better at being functionally literate, reading the signs of what's happening? noticing that these disturbances are telling something about what we're thinking, not about who we are, just simply what we're thinking, since thinking is so primary. All of our data that's being fed to our thoughts is coming from senses that do not interpret them at all. They feed us raw data, our 5+ senses. There's more that I think they're up to 11 or 12 different human senses, but we think of it as 5 because that's historically been the most tactile: smell, sight, hearing, touch, etc. Right? There's more than that. But all that data that's being fed to our brains is just raw data about our environment. What's our environment? Where everybody else is, where everything else is. We're getting fed constantly information. And what are we doing with it? Thinking about it. Our emotions are raw data before we think about them. I feel this. I think that. I like this. I don't like that. Those are all thoughts. The feelings all have words attached. Words are born in, language is born in thought. It's not born in reality and truth. Reality and truth, actually, mathematics is that language, as Gabe made a note to everyone, and we kind of crossed that point earlier. The language of the universe, the material universe, is math, because it can calculate everything. When they send probes out with silver or platinum things to potentially communicate with other life forms, they put mathematical equations on those things. They don't put, hi, we're on Earth.
Well,
We're a civilization on planet Earth. Come find us.
I've never thought about it in terms of math, but I've often wondered if it was music. Like if there was other universes, just notes, sounds, like music.
Yeah, well, music is mathematical too, though. I mean, which is why it can be digitized. And there's argument that the digitization of it isn't as clear as the resonance that's created by the instruments directly. And some people have taken the digital sounds and put them into what used to be used as the best recording studios and re-recorded them within the walls that are wooden and shaped for sound to be held, and all of a sudden it gives a greater richness to the music. But if you think of music, it all breaks down into the same thing that color does effectively, which are sounds. The sounds break down like light breaks down. They're all chords and they're all sort of mathematically quantifiable. And there's resonance to it.
To music.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're saying about light, though.
Well, the resonance of the perfect chord of light is the rainbow, because it reflects the entirety of it. That's why we think of it as like unicorns and rainbows.
Why wouldn't you think it was white light?
What's that? Why wouldn't we think it's white light?
Why wouldn't you think it's white light? Because
we think in divisive terms.
Well,
we think from a relative viewpoint, and the combination of all colors is white.
True.
Yeah.
See,
so again, you're pointing to the fact that the absolute can be seen in what we consider to be relative. So the relative isn't distinct from it; it actually confirms it.
I don't mind cliches as long as people live that cliche, But for example, with grief, there are 5 stages of grief. And I say, why? Who wrote the 5 stages of grief?
Kubler-Ross was the name of the woman. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I think, was her name. She wrote the book back in the 70s or something, and she defined those things. So we think what people think that may come close to reality, or our experience becomes reality. And, it isn't written in stone, literally.
No.
And if it were, it wouldn't make it real. It just is a thought. It's an experience people have. Now, many people have used that to help deal with grief that they didn't seem to be able to unravel. So,
well, I don't know.
It's just a thought.
It's a thought, but sometimes, I don't know. I'm not going to sit around and wait for each stage of grief or whatever. I don't know. what I'm having a problem is if she's saying that's based on her experience, that's one thing. But if she's saying that that's going to be for everyone in the world.
Well, she wasn't somebody who just wrote a book because of her own experience. She had a lot of experience and used it as best she could. But again, Loretta, it may be worth considering that the only issue you're having about what she did is not what she did, but what you're thinking about it. And she may have something in there that's valuable to you if you just begin to realize that thoughts are basically considerations. And decisions are an attempt to use that consideration to come to a conclusion that's worthy of acting on outwardly. So you don't have to agree with it. You don't have to believe in it, but there may be something in it that could be valuable to even notice that there are either stages or processes that people tend to go through as they unravel it. My experience is that you can't unravel grief when you're in the present state of creating a present traumatic stress by making believe the grief exists somewhere other than in the present. And so most, in my experience, most people tend to aim back to the experience that was had, the death or whatever, rather than realize it's what I'm thinking about it now that I'm struggling with. It's not the experience. It's not the death. It's not the occurrence at all. It's what I'm thinking about it. And it was always what I was thinking about it. It wasn't what actually happened. It's what I thought about it that I was grieving over. Why would I grieve over it? If the infinite source is infinite, nobody really dies. Their forms change. The form that they occupied change. It doesn't mean they've gone anywhere. It would mean that they actually are here. And if looking through these eyes, I found that people who died in my life, I started to actually realize I actually had a relationship with them that continued, that I felt very often was clearer than the one we had when they were alive, because I wasn't being as irritated with them as I would be if they were here doing the things I didn't like. I started thinking of them in terms that were much more expansive and inclusive and available than things that I thought only I needed to be with them for and only appreciate when they were doing what I wanted and what I thought they should be doing. And I would say that's somewhat of an awareness that people don't go anywhere. This essence is essential. Listening to those near-death experiences at the bottom of the weekly announcement, you might want to listen to that doctor who talked about it and some of the experience they had. People have profound, vital spiritual experiences in facing death and even experiencing death. That awareness becomes crystal clear to them, so much so that they realize for sure they're not afraid of death anymore, and that there's something else going on that isn't limited to their thinking. And almost every one of them has no interest in going back to their body. Wow. They're all disappointed when they realize they're coming back to planet Earth. And my sense is we've been so convinced that our body is the problem rather than how we think of it, that we think we're condemned to that experience rather than begin to realize that we've been thinking about things wrong, giving ourselves the impression that that absolute nature isn't with us. And if we start speaking about it, there's a very good chance we'll start witnessing it in ways that we can't even imagine, because it'll start to become so obvious that it's always been here. We've just been blinded by the seeming light. Like looking into so much light, you feel blinded by it. But again, if you're looking into pitch black, it doesn't make you blind. It makes you seeing pitch black properly. If you're looking into white light, you're actually blinded by the light because all you see is white. And that awareness is very much what people experiencing in a sense of presence that they say was the most welcoming, inclusive experience they ever had. That sense of being home, that sense of finding that place. What are we doing during life to keep us from that? And we're not being kept from it. We just think we are. What are we doing within our thinking to think that it's not here? And I would say plenty. Probably worth looking at. The beauty about nature is that if you begin to notice it's natural, what's unnatural becomes easier to start to notice, and the requirement to continue to do it when it's looked at honestly becomes no requirement at all, and it starts to fall away without ever having to let go, because it becomes very clear you hung on to nothing but a delusion that an illusion could be true.
Well, near-death experiences are really, basically, if you read them, they're all really kind of relatively the same. Right?
Well, there's variations. There are definitely variations. And in Dr. Grayson's thing, he said about half the people have those profound experiences, and not everybody else does. Some people don't have anything. They don't have any witness to that whatsoever. And whatever, he has a 50-year history of investigating these things. And I think he's at the University of Virginia, if anybody out there is interested in listening. But he had his own experience. And as a scientist said, I can't make sense out of this. And yet it keeps happening, and started actually paying attention to what was happening, and grew an entire organization of people who have taken now chronicled hundreds, if not thousands, of experiences and stories to help look at the roots of not only what happens for people, but what happens as a consequence of that. And in almost all the cases, people have a much different experience in their life, in their approach to people, in their relationships, all of it. They're easier, they're better off. Anyway, it's worth looking at. My sense is if we can do that in near-death experiences, we do not need to wait till near death to be able to experience it. If we start talking about it proactively, the things that keep us from thinking it's there will start to fall away like dandruff, and we get down to the good skin with the collagen and start functioning on a level that actually allows us to notice it and be more aware of it and see that it's always been here. It's always been where we are. It's always been available. It's always been, always, whatever we are, as we are, before we were included, and start to just take the thoughts off of it and realize, oh, this is different, certainly, than the conflict. There's a lot of peace in it. There's a lot of expanse to it. Can be a little discomforting at first, because you can also start seeing the little specks of dust and the little things of impulses that you've been doing that you didn't even think you were doing. And that can be very disturbing to look at initially, because you're looking at something disturbing. When you're looking at disturbing and feeling disturbed, at least you're aligning your thinking with what's happening in your experience, not reality or truth, just something you're inducing, something you're imposing, something that you're creating. It's just an experience. That's all.
That, Janet. That's
so consider for the week. Thoughts are considerations. They're imagining, literally imagining what's happening. They're creating a story about what's happening most often. When I become convinced my thoughts are true, I start developing a whole narrative that lines up with the world. It's got bodies involved and people involved and cars being driven and mountains in the background and all kinds of stuff. I start this story. And I normally attach the story to the circumstances that I'm living, because now I have something to actually point to and say, yep, it's them, it's there, it's over there, not me. Rather than say, no, I can't be seeing it if I'm not doing it. I can't recognize it if I don't have any connection to it. It would be like being blind and all of a sudden saying, oh, the sun's coming up. Wouldn't happen. I might feel the warmth eventually, but I wouldn't say, well, who knows what I might say. I might say all sorts of things. The point is, if I'm doing it, if I'm witnessing it as though it's something happening to me, I'm doing it to be witnessing it. And starting to come to terms with that is a shift, I would say, away from making believe that it's happening to me, or that circumstance or something that's some rare combination and confluence of events. It's very much within the realm of that knowing nature that's creating that stuff. And my experience is it's given me perfect perspective on what I'm not willing to see proactively in my own experience. And it's bringing light to the blindness I want to make believe is my nature, or my defensiveness of trying to deny and fight against these things that are actually happening in my experience, which we can continue on. So those are some little things during the week to homework and just apply. And if you get flustered, say, I'm just considering things in a way that are flustering. And I'm imagining things in a way that are fluster me or bother me or annoy me. And what's interesting is it gives great clarity to the circumstances. It's just being something happening. It's no longer this attack. It's no longer a frontal assault. It's no longer a life-threatening issue. Just happening, just going on, and just witnessing it.
So, Jack, I'm going to send you some stuff. And do you think you can be open-minded?
I think I can, and I think I can't.
Well, seriously?
Yeah, I have the option to do both. No one stripped me of the potential that love offers for me to do whatever I want.
Well, I understand that. I'm just asking if you can be open-minded.
Well, and I just answered you, yes, I can be, and I can be closed-minded too.
Well,
Now, that's all within thinking, by the way. In terms of knowing, there's nothing to be open to. It's already an open book. It's already absolutely the essence of everything that exists. There is no doubt in there. There is no lack. There's no missing pieces. There's no parts. There's nothing hidden. There's no mystery. It's absolutely as it is right now, always has been, always will be. It's the nature of our existence to even have this conversation.
Well, this is something I have had experience with that allows me to have more open-mindedness to learn different things. That's all.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that you're also speaking to your openness and your ability to notice that if that thing you call open, it was ever shut, you have the ability to be very flexible with it because probably never was shut. It was just thought to be shut. And that flexibility in noticing that starts to actually notice that things we thought were stuck and inherent and intrinsic, which is really what addiction is, something I can't do anything about, something that doesn't change, something that's cornered me, something that I have to do. It's all coming from these thoughts that somehow it's intractable, rather than notice that if we can have a sliding scale, those thoughts are very flexible. They're not stuck at all. If I can change the effect I'm experiencing by simply doing something, I'm proving that those thoughts are very flexible and they are not stuck. And yet, the more I do it, the more blind I am to what's happening. So I don't pay attention to what's actually happening. I pay attention to what I think is happening. And that's the mental addiction. I need to wrap this up. So
okay, let me just say this. The day I think that I cannot be wrong is when I'm very limited. That's how I look at it. So
yeah.
I just, I'm always learning or hope to. But anyway.
Well, in a knowing sense, there's nothing to learn. And that's a concession that may take a minute. But if it's true and it's accurate, and I would say if truth is true, it would be accurate, is to notice that is our nature. And that's what makes us painfully aware of the things we do that don't reflect that nature, that do not reflect that nature, that do not align with that nature. And it isn't because they're true and real and not aligned. It's because we're delusional about what we're thinking in relation to them that's causing the problem. We begin to believe that delusion is reality and who I am is what I think and all that stuff that comes from it. Humanity has been doing this as long as humanity has been thinking this way. And it goes back to every recorded story and every writer. It's been contained in almost all the literature, including the Bible and the Torah and the Quran. All of it talks about this line of indignation that occurs to people thinking that you need to kill other people to resolve issues for God, as though God's sitting up there thinking, I'm a mess. I need somebody to come to my rescue. I need therapy. Please help me out. Kill some of the people I created to help me solve this problem. It's been going on since the beginning of recorded history. Do we need to perpetuate it? No. Will we? Probably to some degree.
Well, and the argument that if we don't believe in a certain correct way, we don't get everlasting life. There's always going to be a religious argument.
I don't know that there always will be, because there certainly wasn't before religion started. So let's just open that ball up a little bit.
All right.
It isn't particularly religion that's wrong. Like most organizations, their intent tends to be pure. The way it's carried out by the people that run it isn't always that pure, because it becomes the organization becomes self-serving in the way that it fights for its own existence, rather than start to see that if it's falling apart, let it, kind of like in AA. If a meeting doesn't work, nobody fights for it. It just stops happening. Somebody else creates another one somewhere else. There's a fluidity to it that allows for that failure. And the rule 62 in Alcoholics Anonymous is that we have the right to be wrong. There's a lot of freedom in that. And they spoke to the group, but the groups are made up of individuals. So where it applies to the group, it applies to each of us. I love you guys. Thank you for today. This was great.
All right. Bye-bye.
Send me what you've got, Loretta. Thanks.
Aloha. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Jonna,
you,
MK, David, John.
Hey, Anthony.
Thank you.